Does Yahweh exist? This is a question avoided by many scholars of the Bible. To be precise, this isn't the same thing as asking whether a God exists. But for some, if Yahweh doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist. It's rather obvious why that seems a natural conclusion. There is only one God in many believers' minds. And if that one God isn't real, then what is true anymore? This topic quickly enters the philosophical domain. But what if we can have philosophy and biblical scholarship kiss to help us solve the question of Yahweh's existence? Does this pique your interest? Buckle up, folks, and welcome to the wild ride where we tackle Yahweh's existence. We are asking the heavyweight question: does God really exist? Or is it all just celestial smoke and mirrors? Before we dive in, let's not get ahead of ourselves. What in the world do we mean by God? And hold on, where do we even start with this cosmic conundrum? Now, some folks love to twist this question into a pretzel, making it as complicated as a cat's cradle. But we're cutting through the clutter by zeroing in on a specific divine suspect, Yahweh. Does he have a real estate in reality? Or is he just a figment of ancient imagination? We're not just throwing darts in the dark here. We're diving deep into the murky waters of ontological mysteries and the wild world of religious linguistics in the Old Testament and Hebrew Bible. Enter the ring, Professor Yako Gerber, straight from Northwest University, South Africa. Picture this: a guy who was knee-deep in theology, Semitic languages, and philosophy at the University of Pretoria from 1994 to 2004. From a die-hard Reformed Christian plotting his missionary path toward ordination to a man who hung his faith hat. Why? Because Yako started asking the tough questions. Like, if we're supposed to just believe, what on earth are we believing in? Especially when the script seems more fiction than fact. To quote him, quote, "For when looking at the biblical texts that were somehow always in the background, irrespective of whether one was conservative, liberal, or radical in one's Christian views, there was nothing believable there," end quote. After ditching his divine duties in '99, Yako made a comeback in 2001, diving headfirst into philosophy of religion, with special attention poking holes via contradictions in the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, with a scholarly stick. Fast forward through a master's, a doctorate in Semitic languages, and a PhD in Old Testament. What do you get? A thesis that dared to ask, does Yahweh exist? Spoiler, it's not your Sunday school lesson. The paper is called "Does Yahweh Exist? A Philosophical Critical Reconstruction of the Case Against Realism in Old Testament Theology." In this monumental paper, he shows how it became impossible to think of depictions of God in the Bible referring to anything outside of the texts. Yako didn't just stop there. He evolved, shedding his believer's skin to don the coat of a biblical scholar with a twist. He's an atheist with a philosopher's eye. Being Old Testament scholarship was the only context completely secular in his location. He reinvented himself as a biblical scholar. He wrote several publications which do not involve the exegetical fallacies of the past, such as The Hebrew Bible and Philosophy of Religion, SBL 2012. What is a God? Philosophical Perspectives on Divine Essence in the Hebrew Bible, TNT Clark 2017. And A Philosophical Theology of the Old Testament, a historical, experimental, comparative, and analytic perspective, Routledge 2020. Yako has also written a chapter on Israel and the Near East for the Cambridge Companion to the History of Atheism, Cambridge 2021. So what's on the docket for today? A blast from the past to 2004, when Yako's PhD threw down the gauntlet, challenging the very existence of Yahweh as anything more than an ancient literary character. Before we tackle his 7 reasons why the big guy upstairs might be more myth than manager, let's get our brains in gear for a discussion that's anything but heavenly polite. Strap in. It's going to be a thought-provoking journey through belief, disbelief, and everything in between. Welcome to the Existential Express, where no question is too sacred and no doubt too daring. Let's get this philosophical party started, and please do pay close attention, because before we unload 7 absolute jugular jabbing and thorough arguments against the existence of Yahweh that you will want to keep in your pocket, we must first initiate what kind of arena we are entering. Old Testament scholars and the God debates. The wild, wild west of academia, theology, where the quest for divine truth is more heated than a final round in Jeopardy, and the relevance of studying the heavens is questioned more than your uncle's conspiracy theories at Thanksgiving dinner. It's a place where the very subject that's supposed to be all about higher callings often gets the side eye, like it's trying to sell you a slightly used car. Now, despite the eye rolls and the thanks but no thanks from both the church pew and the science lab, the debates around those holy texts are hotter than a summer's blockbuster. Yep, even the folks who swear the Bible is better used as a coaster are still sneakily thumbing through its pages to win an argument on Twitter. And the believers? They're in there too, swinging their holy swords in the comment sections. But here's the kicker. While God talk is everywhere from TikTok debates to presidential speeches, the rock stars of biblical scholarship are backstage, unknown. Your average Joe is more likely to quote Albert Einstein, Carl Sagan, Stephen Hawking, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan on matters of the divine than someone who actually spent their life deciphering ancient Hebrew. The face of the Old Testament in the public eye is less scholarly sage and more celebrity tweet. On the Christian side, it is often philosophers of religion, apologists, and church pastors whose views are taken as representative of the public face of Yahweh. However, don't lose faith just yet. There's a change in the wind. Biblical scholars are finally getting their 15 minutes of fame, popping up on podcast and YouTube, spicing up the conversation with some long overdue expertise. Scholars like Dan McClellan, Joshua Bowen, Kip Davis, Kenneth Moss, Robin Faith Walsh, James Tabor, Richard Carrier, Richard C. Miller, Bart D. Ehrman, M. David Litwa, Dennis McDonald, and the endless academics brought to the public view by channels like MythVision and History Valley, and many more. But let's face it, the philosophical deep dives and scholarly debates are still flying over most heads like a dense academic drone. For the most part, the public doesn't seem aware of the philosophical implications of biblical scholarship, which we will unravel. Old Testament scholars themselves, it seems, debate the existence of almost everything mentioned in the text, except whether or not Yahweh actually exists. Unlike New Testament scholars, whether something about the character Jesus in the text is historical or not, asking similar questions about the character Yahweh, who is also differently named, as opposed to stories, events, or artifacts, seems a bit odd. One reason pertains to interdisciplinary divisions of labor. Worrying about arguments for or against the existence of a deity is something for philosophy of religion. Old Testament scholars are by profession more interested in linguistic, historical, literary, and sociological issues appearing to arise from within the discourses represented by the Old Testament texts. The relationship between philosophical concepts, concerns, and categories and biblical scholarship is more complex and nuanced in practice. So bear with me for a moment. On the one hand, all perspectives on the text involve philosophical presuppositions, problems, and perspective as their conditions of possibility. On the other hand, historical consciousness requires that scholarly discussions of Yahweh aim to avoid imposing anachronistic philosophical presuppositions, problems, and perspectives onto the biblical depictions of deities. Even so, biblical scholars do not simply read the text. To illustrate this, it might be helpful to distinguish between so-called first and second order religious languages in biblical scholarship. First-order language refers to the direct original language of the Old Testament, such as the Hebrew and Aramaic names and descriptions of deities. These are the actual words found in the scripture. The second-order religious language, on the other hand, includes the English terms used to analyze, interpret, translate, clarify, and critique the biblical text. Words like reality, exists, language, history, and texts are examples of second-order language. These terms come from various scholarly disciplines, such as linguistics, literary criticism, historical analysis, sociology, anthropology, and theology. Scholars use these terms to bring perspectives from their fields to help understand the Bible, but they are not part of the original biblical language. When biblical scholars discuss Yahweh using second-order language, they have to choose specific terms and concepts from these disciplines. This selection process inevitably simplifies the complex nature of the deity as described in the Old Testament, because it imposes a modern framework onto an ancient text. Therefore, any scholarly discussion about Yahweh or any other biblical subject can be reductive. This means it tends to simplify the subject by looking at it from one angle, using the specific language and concepts of that viewpoint. This is a common challenge in biblical scholarship, as it is often difficult to fully capture the multifaceted nature of the biblical text with contemporary terminology and perspectives. Historical perspective. Yahweh is viewed through the lens of historical evolution, with a focus on the deity's origins and development in the ancient religions of Israel and Judah, which is distinct from how Yahweh is represented in texts. Literary perspective. Yahweh becomes a character within the narrative framework of the biblical stories, analyzed as a literary element rather than a religious or historical figure. Sociological perspective. Yahweh is seen as a social symbol, holding varying significances across different communities and social structures, such as clans, villages, or states. Psychological perspective. Yahweh is interpreted as a mental construct, a concept formed in human cognition in relation to other mental constructs within the same theoretical framework. And theological perspective. Yahweh is understood in the context of theological traditions, characterized by divine nature and attributes as seen in later Jewish and Christian traditions. Each of these perspectives, while providing valuable insights, can be seen as reductive, meaning they simplify the complex nature of Yahweh by viewing the deity through a specific academic or disciplinary lens. This reflects a broader understanding that when we discuss Yahweh's existence or any aspect of the deity, we're influenced by the specific academic framework we're using, whether that's history, literature, sociology, psychology, or theology. The final point is that in biblical scholarship, there's no such thing as an entirely neutral, unbiased approach. Every single reading of a biblical text is colored by the particular academic discipline that the reader brings to it. And this is true for scholars and laypersons alike. This means that discussions about biblical figures always carry with them the assumptions and focus of the disciplinary lens through which they are being viewed. The existence of God as a topic in Old Testament scholarship. Philosophy, as an auxiliary discipline, has been gradually reintegrating into biblical scholarship. However, the integration is selective. For instance, while applied ethics, hermeneutics, and social philosophy have become integral to biblical studies and don't face much contention, the philosophy of religion is often kept at arm's length. This is due in part to the sensitive nature of discussions around the existence of deities, which are central to the philosophy of religion, but less so to other philosophical areas that have been more readily adopted into biblical scholarship. Old Testament scholars regularly engage with issues of biblical morality and the conceptualization of divinity, but they typically steer clear of directly tackling the philosophical arguments or against the existence of Yahweh. When philosophy of religion does appear in biblical scholarship, it's often in brief references to continental philosophy or indirectly through disciplines like cognitive linguistics, in discussions about metaphorical language, for example, or through theology. Within biblical scholarship, statements about the existence of Yahweh are often limited to. They reiterate what the Old Testament claims about God or Yahweh as some sort of reality. They clarify the meaning of what this does and doesn't mean in light of later philosophical ideas about divine existence. They discuss the apparent absence of atheism, as we understand it today, in ancient texts which seem to deny the existence of God. They categorize extreme disbelief as practical atheism regarding Yahweh. They analyze polemics against other gods, especially in the context of idolatry critiques. Regarding the ontological status of Yahweh, or what it means to affirm Yahweh's existence, scholars maintain a range of views, often aligned with realist or non-realist interpretations, such as naive realism. This approach treats the text as transparent, suggesting that Yahweh, as described in the Old Testament, is a direct depiction of God. The text is considered synonymous with divine communication. There's critical realism. Here, the representation of Yahweh in the text is seen as a flawed reflection of some reality. The text is an imperfect expression, more akin to a painting than a window, of the divine. It's a blend of divine revelation and human articulation. Then there's non-realism. From this perspective, the descriptions of Yahweh in the text are seen as purely human constructs, with no reference to an external deity. The text is a mirror reflecting human experiences and expressions rather than divine realities. It's essential to note that a scholar's stance on the depiction of Yahweh within the text doesn't necessarily reveal their personal beliefs about God's existence outside the text. A scholar may, for instance, approach biblical narratives about Yahweh as non-literal, non-realist, while still maintaining a belief in God, critical realist. While there might be a tendency to associate naive realism with fundamentalist views, the reality is indeed more nuanced. Scholarly positions are varied and often require careful unpacking to understand the implications for both the study and belief in the biblical depiction of the divine, as we will see later on. On philosophical fallacies in exegesis. Despite the Old Testament's implicit assumption of Yahweh's existence without explicit argumentation, it would be incorrect to conclude that scholars of the Old Testament should refrain from engaging with this line of inquiry. The Old Testament, whether presenting the deity in human-like terms or personifying Israel in its narratives, does not explicitly address the existence of other beings or entities within its text. This, however, has not deterred scholars from investigating the historical existence of figures such as Adam or Moses or Abraham. When it comes to philosophical questions, it's important to acknowledge that many of our contemporary concerns might not align directly with the text's original context, leading to potential anachronisms. Yet this mismatch does not inherently distort our understanding. Rather, it highlights the importance of approaching these texts with historical awareness. For instance, the Old Testament does not delve into discussions about Hebrew grammar, narrative structure, poetic devices, the development of Israelite religion, societal organization, or explicit theological discourse. Despite the anachronistic nature of these subjects, meaning they apply our contemporary understanding retrospectively, they do not necessarily lead to a misunderstanding of the text. The absence of explicit discussion on these topics by the text's authors invites modern scholars to explore these areas, aiming to avoid projecting modern interpretations and biases onto ancient writings. Arguing that discussions around the existence of Yahweh or any other biblical figure are more problematic than exploring other textual references overlooks the broad scope of biblical scholarship. Such a stance also imposes unnecessary limitations on scholarly inquiry, not justified by the practices of biblical authors themselves, who did not engage with the text in the way modern readers do. Furthermore, suggesting that Old Testament scholars should exclude philosophical or religious inquiries represents a double standard when compared to other academic disciplines. The relationship between biblical interpretation and philosophy, particularly in the turbulent 20th century, has significantly shaped our current understanding of these texts. Just as Old Testament scholars routinely incorporate historical, sociological, and literary analysis into their work, there's no compelling reason to exclude philosophical reflections from their scope of study. Engaging with these texts through a philosophical lens is not only permissible, but necessary for a comprehensive understanding of their meaning and relevance. The existence of Yahweh versus the existence of God. Philosophers of religion who debate the existence of God typically do not limit their discussions to the portrayal of Yahweh in the Old Testament. Their interest often extends beyond the ancient religious context of Israel and Judah, focusing more on the theological developments within post-biblical Judaism and Christianity. Thus, when these scholars construct arguments about the existence of God, relying solely on the Old Testament could be seen as a misstep. The concerns of biblical scholars regarding the depiction of Yahweh are distinct from the broader philosophical debates about God's existence. In essence, the biblical scholar has the unique privilege, if they choose, to delve into the nuances of how Yahweh is depicted in the Old Testament, without necessarily engaging with later theological arguments. Those arguing against the existence of Yahweh based on the biblical text must navigate the complexities of biblical scholarship, rather than applying atheist critiques developed in the context of Christian philosophy. Such arguments may lack relevance or validity when applied to the ancient religious framework of Old Testament Yahwism. For instance, arguing against Yahweh's existence without addressing the differences between ancient and contemporary conceptions of deity could undermine the argument. Popular atheistic objections, including the problem of evil, may not effectively challenge Yahweh's existence as depicted in the Old Testament, especially if Yahweh is portrayed as having the power to do both good and evil. In this context, the deity's actions, even those considered evil, might be seen as demonstrations of divine power rather than as reasons to doubt its existence. The modern expectation that a deity must be wholly good or not worthy of belief, or that belief in a god's existence is the primary religious concern, does not align with the Old Testament's portrayal of Yahweh. The Old Testament does not mandate a belief in Yahweh's existence as a core religious obligation. Therefore, critics must engage with the text as it is, acknowledging the depiction of a deity that is not exclusively benevolent, and exploring why such depictions might be challenging for contemporary understandings. In sum, when biblical scholars or critics address the portrayal of Yahweh in the Old Testament, they confront a task distinct from the general philosophical debate about God's existence. Their challenge is to explore the implications of these ancient texts for modern readers, recognizing that the issues they uncover may reflect contemporary concerns rather than those of the original authors or audiences. Arguments against the existence of Yahweh. This discussion doesn't suggest ignoring modern interpretations of God or the philosophical debates that come with them when examining the Old Testament. Instead, it proposes that these contemporary concepts and concerns can be cleverly applied and reshaped to challenge the literal interpretation of Yahweh's existence as presented in these ancient texts. The idea is to critically engage with the Old Testament's portrayal of Yahweh and argue that this depiction does not necessarily refer to a real entity beyond the text itself. The connection between this analysis and broader notions of God is complex and intricate. To navigate this complexity, I introduce 7 carefully crafted arguments designed to address the inherent ontological, which means concerning the nature of being, issues found in various scholarly interpretations of Old Testament narratives. The arguments will be listed as such. 1. The argument from theological pluralism. 2. The argument from unorthodox theology. 3. The argument from polymorphic projection. 4. The argument from mythology and syncretism. 5. The argument from fictitious cosmography. 6. The argument from fictitious history. 7. The argument from metatextual history. By these arguments, the following may briefly be said as part of the introduction to the case proper. The argument from intratextual theological pluralism critically examines the diverse and sometimes conflicting portrayals of Yahweh within the Old Testament. This argument is grounded in the observation that the text presents various, often contradictory, descriptions of Yahweh's nature, actions, and moral expectations. These inconsistencies challenge the notion of a single, unified conception of Yahweh, suggesting instead a complex collage of competing views and ideologies. Firstly, the argument highlights direct contradictions in the depiction of Yahweh's characteristics and deeds. For instance, Yahweh is portrayed in some texts as merciful and forgiving, while in others as wrathful and punishing. Similarly, the moral standards Yahweh upholds vary significantly across different books and stories, with some narratives emphasizing strict justice and others championing mercy and compassion. Secondly, the argument draws upon diachronic studies, including tradition and source criticism, to further complicate the picture. These scholarly approaches reveal that the Old Testament is the product of numerous authors, communities, and historical periods, each contributing their own perspectives and theological emphases. This diachronic complexity leads to serious ontological questions about the reality of Yahweh as depicted in these texts. If Yahweh were to exist outside the text, the diverse and contradictory representations within the Old Testament suggest that not all of these portrayals could accurately reflect this external reality. The presence of such mutually exclusive depictions within the Old Testament leads to the conclusion that a realistic interpretation based on any singular Old Testament view of Yahweh is not tenable. Instead of one coherent picture, what emerges is a collection of disparate ideologies, each presenting its own understanding of Yahweh's nature and actions. This plurality indicates that while the Old Testament offers a rich source of theological and moral reflection, it does not provide a consistent or unified portrayal of Yahweh that could serve as the basis for a realistic ontology. The argument from unorthodox theology is presented. Here, the focus will be on how realism in the Old Testament's depictions of Yahweh apparently collapses by Orthodox Christian philosophical theology. The argument is that if there is only one God, and this God conforms to the profile constructed by stereotypical Christian philosophical theology, Yahweh, as depicted in the text, must be a character of fiction. As long as the real God is conceived as being eternal, single, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and omnibenevolent, the deity Yahweh, who is often depicted as not exhibiting any of these attributes, obviously has no extra-textual counterpart. The bottom line is that if God exists, Yahweh doesn't. The argument from polymorphic projection explores a significant challenge within Old Testament theology, the portrayal of Yahweh using human-like characteristics, behaviors, and emotions, a concept known as anthropomorphism. Additionally, it addresses sociomorphism, where divine actions and societal structures are mirrored after human societies, and psychomorphism, attributing human psychology or thought processes to the deity. These representations are not just minor issues. They raise profound questions about the authenticity of divine depiction in the scriptures. The core issue, as this argument presents, is not merely about the ancient Israelites' limited understanding of the world, history, and morality. The real challenge to the realism of biblical theism lies in the portrayal of Yahweh himself. The depiction suggests that Yahweh's views and actions do not surpass the cultural and historical biases of the people who wrote the texts. Instead of portraying a deity that transcends human limitations, the scriptures often present Yahweh in ways that reflect the all-too-human perspectives of his narrators. By showing that Yahweh's interactions with the world and his moral judgments are closely aligned with the beliefs and superstitions of the time, this argument points to the possibility that the character of Yahweh is more a construct of human imagination than a depiction of a real transcendent being. This perspective challenges the traditional view of Yahweh as the creator, and instead suggests the deity may be a creation of human cultural and historical context. The argument from mythology and syncretism. Here, the ontological implications of embarrassing elements in the Old Testament text, such as parallels with other ancient mythologies, ample evidence of syncretism, the belief in magic, and traces of superstition will be spelled out. It will be argued that the presence of these elements in Old Testament God talk makes realism in Old Testament theology problematic, as it suggests that the ontological status of the deity is demonstrably not much different from any other god featured in ancient Near Eastern mythology. The argument from fictitious cosmography deals with the ontological implications of the fictitious elements in Old Testament cosmology. It will be demonstrated there are numerous locations in the world in the text, with no counterparts in extra-textual reality. The problem, once again, concerns not merely the fact of Israel's primitive conceptions of the world, but the embarrassing truth that the God Yahweh himself shared its erroneous beliefs, and that his alleged revelation and acts even presuppose the empirical veracity of such conceptions. The main concern of this topic deals with the question of Yahweh's supposed whereabouts in actual reality, as Yahweh is often depicted as literally dwelling up there in the skies, and this is demonstrably not the case in the world outside the text. Realism regarding the ontological status of the deity can actually be falsified by empirical means. The argument from fictitious history. This argument against the existence of Yahweh can be seen as consisting, on the one hand, of various sub-arguments demonstrating why it has become problematic to believe that the scenarios featuring Yahweh, as depicted in the biblical texts, actually happened as depicted. On the other hand, an attempt is made to explain why the presence of fiction in the texts depicting the acts of Yahweh leads to the radical, albeit often repressed, conclusion that Yahweh as depicted in the text is himself a character of fiction, with no extra-textual counterpart. Since the nature of the texts allows one to demonstrate that the God Yahweh never really appeared, spoke, and acted in the ways depicted, it follows that no sufficient grounds remain to justify realism regarding the ontological status of the deity. In other words, if Yahweh plays a significant role in the fictional historical account, and that account never happened in the real world, then Yahweh cannot be said to have done the things described in that account in the real world, making Yahweh a fictional character in that story. The argument from metatextual history will be concerned with the philosophical dilemmas for realism, as these are implicit in the critical reconstructions of the origin, nature, and developments of both Yahwistic religion and the text that later became the Old Testament. It will be argued that rather than Yahwism being the true religion and the Old Testament being the inerrant, infallible, and inspired Word of God, A combined historical and philosophical approach to the origin and development of both Yahwism and the Old Testament implies otherwise. The history of Old Testament interpretations may even be construed as a history of repressed anti-realism. Finally, one can go so far as to suggest that both contemporary conservative and critical attempts to salvage realism are half-baked and hypocritical. All the anticipated possible objections to the case against realism are demonstrably riddled with informal fallacies. Simplifying the debate around the use of Yahweh and the Old Testament, it's clear that just sticking to these terms misses the broader complexities and nuances of biblical text. Readers might find some arguments too strong or not fully considering other scholarly ideas and developments in theology or philosophy. Despite this, questioning the literal existence of Yahweh doesn't hinge on every point being perfect. The discussion pulls from a wide range of biblical scholarship, aiming to encourage thought rather than claiming to have all the answers. It suggests moving away from a strictly literal interpretation of Yahweh without expecting unanimous agreement. This dialogue is part of a larger debate on whether the biblical depiction of Yahweh can represent a real entity. It's understood that proving such a stance is challenging, given the non-literal nature of many biblical texts and the vast interpretations available. Yet the discussion invites a reconsideration of how we interpret these ancient texts and the divine figures within them, acknowledging that our understanding is always evolving. Furthermore, the conversation acknowledges the diversity of divine names and the layered meanings of terms like God and Old Testament, each with its own set of complexities and historical baggage. It recognizes the ongoing debate and evolution in biblical scholarship without dismissing new insights that have emerged since the early 2000s. In essence, this is an open invitation to explore and question the text more deeply, even if definitive conclusions remain elusive, highlighting the ongoing journey of biblical interpretation and understanding. The argument from theological pluralism. When considering the existence of Yahweh as depicted in the Old Testament, it's essential to start by defining the attributes of this deity. One cannot simply affirm or deny a god's existence without clarity on what characterizes the god in question. Every argument for or against the existence of Yahweh hinges on a precise understanding of the divine nature being discussed. However, the task of defining Yahweh's nature is fraught with challenges. The Old Testament presents a range of portrayals that often seem contradictory, which poses a significant obstacle for those arguing from a realistic standpoint that the depiction of Yahweh in these texts matches an actual being in reality. These varied depictions lead to theological pluralism, not in a harmonious sense, but in a way that introduces conflicting attributes for the deity. So if one were to attempt to prove Yahweh's existence based on scriptural depictions or descriptions, they would face a critical question from skeptics. Which depiction of Yahweh are we considering? Since not all contradictory versions can reflect a singular existing reality, excluding unorthodox experiences of conflicting realities. Establishing Yahweh's existence becomes even more complex. If one portrayal is true, others in direct contradiction must be false. This dilemma underscores the difficulty of arguing for the real existence of a deity like Yahweh, who is represented with such variety and inconsistency in the Old Testament. What kind of being is God? What are God's main qualities according to sacred texts? To understand this, we can look at the different ways God is described in the Old Testament's various books. When we compare these descriptions, we find that they don't always match up. There are many instances where the descriptions of God's nature and characteristics seem to contradict each other. A Yahweh who is the only God. A Yahweh who is not the only God. A Yahweh who is practically omniscient. A Yahweh who is not omniscient. A Yahweh who knows the future. A Yahweh who does not know the future. A Yahweh who changes his mind and repents. A Yahweh who does not change his mind and repent. A Yahweh who is responsible for all evil. A Yahweh who is not responsible for all evil. A Yahweh who frequently appears to people. A Yahweh who seldom or never appears to people. A Yahweh who has human form. A Yahweh who is nothing like humans. A Yahweh who needs to sleep or rest. A Yahweh who never sleeps or rests. A Yahweh who is merely a national deity. A Yahweh who is a universal deity. A Yahweh who is not omnipresent. A Yahweh who is omnipresent. A Yahweh who is sovereign, in control, and fearless. A Yahweh who is unsure of himself and afraid. That these texts can and have been interpreted in ways that would mean there is no contradiction can be granted, as long as it is acknowledged that they are usually understood by critical scholars as incommensurable at some level. Moreover, the reality of such basic contradictions regarding Yahweh's nature inevitably leads the consistent philosophical critical interpreter to one of either three possible conclusions. 1. Yahweh who is X exists, and the Yahweh who is not X does not. 2. Yahweh who is not X exists, while the Yahweh who is X does not. 3. No Yahweh exists at all. Whichever of the alternatives one opts for, realism, with regard at least some of the depictions of Yahweh in the text, collapses. Examples of theological contradictions pertaining to Yahweh's actions. The problem of contradictory depictions of Yahweh can also be seen when one attempts to reconstruct a record of the deity's alleged actions in the world. The following are examples of mutually exclusive views pertaining to exactly what it is that Yahweh had done in the past. Contradictory creation accounts. Contradictory accounts of the first revelation of the divine name. Contradictory claims regarding the deity's causal relation and exact actions in certain scenarios. Contradictory claims regarding the ways in which Yahweh relate to and intervene in the human world. Contradictory views of Yahweh regarding the establishment of the cult during the desert wanderings. Contradictory relations between Yahweh and the forces of chaos. Contradictory ipsissima verba, which is Latin for very words, of the dialogues that Yahweh allegedly engaged in, meaning the very words of Yahweh contradict. Contradictory envisioned future actions of Yahweh. Contradictory relations between Yahweh and the dead. These are but a few examples of the discrepant views in the text pertaining to the supposed actions of Yahweh in the world and in the lives of people. The problem here is not whether the texts are historical or not. Neither is there the presumption of a coherent plot. We are merely pointing to the fact that the juxtaposed references, if contradictory, cannot refer to the same entity outside the text. Though some might think such an emphasis on technicalities is pedantic, the law of non-contradiction applies here too. If the Old Testament deity does have an extra-textual counterpart, then either the Yahweh who did X exists, and the version of Yahweh who did not do X does not, or vice versa. Alternatively, Yahweh does not exist at all. Whichever of the depictions one opts for, it spells the end of realism concerning all the other depictions that stand in a mutually exclusive relation to the preferred version of the deity's acts. Examples of theological contradictions pertaining to Yahweh's will. Another variety of theological contradictions pertains to the ethical dimension of the Old Testament's depictions of the deity whose existence it takes for granted. But what exactly is the will of Yahweh? What does he consider to be right and wrong? In an attempt to supply an answer to these questions, the astute reader, not blinded by dogma, will encounter a host of contradictory views that defy harmonization. The following examples of some of the many ethical contradictions should suffice to prove the point. Yahweh considers it right that children should be punished for the sins of parents. Yahweh considers it wrong that children should be punished for the sins of parents. Yahweh demands that worship be centralized and limited to one particular place. Yahweh does not demand centralized worship confined to one particular place. Yahweh will never allow Moabites into his congregation. Yahweh will allow Moabites into the congregation. Yahweh approves of Jehu's killings. Yahweh denounces Jehu's killings. Yahweh commanded the burning of children. Yahweh did not command the burning of children. Yahweh wanted the people to have a king. Yahweh did not want the people to have a king. Yahweh does not want the king of his people to be rich. Yahweh wants his chosen king to be rich. Yahweh forbids eunuchs to ever enter into his congregation. Yahweh does not forbid eunuchs to ever enter into his congregation. It is forbidden to marry a sister or brother who had a different mother. It is not forbidden to marry a sister or brother who had a different mother. Yahweh specifically tells Moses he wants a bullock to be offered for the sins of the congregation. Yahweh specifically tells Moses it is a he-goat that must be offered for the sins of congregation. Yahweh specifies that Levites can begin to serve in the temple at age 25. Yahweh specifies that Levites can begin to serve in the temple at age 30. Yahweh is extremely concerned with moral virtue and piety. Yahweh is not extremely concerned with moral virtue and piety. Given the reality of these discrepancies, one may consider realism in Old Testament ethics to be unjustified and its ontological perspective collapses. Either Yahweh who is for X is real, or Yahweh who is against X is real. Both cannot be true, but both can be false if Yahweh himself does not exist. For the present, however, if one does not wish to accept the latter conclusion, then the only option is to pick and choose between the mutually exclusive views. Whichever of these depictions of Yahweh one opts for, if consistency means anything, one must conclude that the opposing depiction is not true, and therefore Yahweh as depicted therein is not true. Now I know, from my own experience, Derek Lambert, and I'm sure Yako has experienced this as well, that gymnastics will take place on every pericope, every example, typically by Christians, fundamentalists online, to rectify, to try and reinterpret, to try and find ways to get around every single one of these examples. But by the end of this documentary, there are so many and so much overwhelming evidence and scholarship that backs what Yako's saying in this documentary that nothing but special pleading seems to be the kind of identification I would give to someone who is doing these kind of behaviors with these texts. An honest, real student who's researching and looking into these will have to wrestle with this reality on Yahweh. The ontological implications of tradition criticism. Another way to provide a perspective on the collapse of realism via theological contradictions involves something other than synchronically pitting selected texts against each other. In other words, in order to criticize realism, one may also approach the issue diachronically and consider the ontological implications of the way the traditions about the nature, acts, and will of the deity, Yahweh, developed in the history of what is often called Israelite religions, among others. In other words, one may be able to demonstrate that realism regarding the ontological status of Yahweh is problematic by spelling out the ontological implications of what the interpretive approach, known as tradition criticism, has discovered concerning the development of Old Testament traditions. Though the approach is nowadays less popular and some theoretical aspects thereof dated, the problems in relation to which the ideas developed remain in the text regardless of whether one speaks of traditions or use newer interpretive frames of reference. For example, composition, redaction, editing, cultural memory, scribal ideology, rewriting, interbiblical interpretation, or dialogue, intertextuality, etc. Many of the stories constituting the tradition were at first, or later on, transmitted orally and during other stages scripturally. The process of transmission did not simply involve a mindless copying and reproduction of what was perceived to be unalterable details of inerrant discourse concerning Yahweh. To be sure, the traditions were handed down in dynamic fashion, marked by interactive and creative reinterpretation, recontextualization, recasting, and reconstructing, which means they were changing this and the tradition of Yahweh over time. Nothing was ever set in stone. The depiction of the deity Yahweh appears to have been continually reshaped and reinterpreted to meet contemporary theological and psychological needs, and to bring it into conformity with present social and political matrices. Whether one is thinking of the stories about creation, the patriarchs, the Exodus, the wanderings in the wilderness, the conquest of Canaan, the period of the monarchy, the exile, or the post-exilic period, etc., matters little. Tradition criticism has demonstrated that what we have in the Old Testament are not the unmodified and original versions of these stories. In other words, old scenarios featuring Yahweh were often reinterpreted and reconstructed, the outcome of which has Yahweh being a different sort of deity, saying different things and doing different deeds. Consequently, when a depiction of Yahweh in any of the traditions is compared with earlier or later versions of itself, the result is not a coherent and harmonizable account of the nature, words, and acts of the deity. The end result of this transmission process was therefore not one static and monolithic tradition, but a plethora of often mutually exclusive traditions resulting from different adaptations and alterations within the different religious communities. Whatever the earliest tradition's relation to reality, the amount of adaptation these underwent implies that whatever the truth of the discourse, the scenarios featuring Yahweh never actually happened according to the details to be found in the final forms of contemporary canonical Old Testament texts. For those who fail to appreciate the ontological ramifications of these discoveries, I would like to spell out what it appears to translate to in layman's terms. When the text depicts Yahweh as speaking to and interacting with people like Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Solomon, David, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and others, it is not providing us with a factual report of actual events. What we encounter in the Old Testament concerning the details of the speeches and acts of Yahweh are, technically speaking, no more than fictitious literary constructs. As such, it represents the ideology of particular religious traditions at a particular point in time. The biblical discourse, therefore, do not feature what was known to be true, but rather what some people considered to be true, and what they would like others to believe to be true. Now, if one were then to insist that Yahweh as depicted in the text actually does exist, the philosophically minded tradition critic might once again respond with the question, which version again? Even should one make the choice for only a single depiction of Yahweh in the text and ignore all others that contradict it, the problems with realism do not go away, because the depictions of Yahweh currently featured in the texts are often at odds with themselves as they were articulated during an earlier phase of the transmission process. Realism remains problematic. When the history of religion is no longer bracketed by the philosophy of religion, anti-realism seems to be the inevitable result. Ontological implications of source criticism. A second means of criticizing realism from a diachronic point over time of view involves spelling out the ontological implications of a source-critical explanation for the theological pluralism in the Old Testament. In fact, source-critical analyses has not only uncovered a plethora of sources in the text, but has also demonstrated that the various sources often contain conflicting, if not contradictory, views about Yahweh. Source-critical hypotheses have been modified and, in some cases, abandoned in recent times. However, the religious language associated with the hypothetical sources and the contradictions within them remain, even if one rejects source criticism altogether. For this reason, what follows, though dependent on the stereotyped version familiar to most, to the extent that people are familiar therewith, has implications which are not dependent on whether one agrees with the source identification, name, dating, or division, even if they are identified with a line of multiple anonymous scribal redactors over time. There may be other reasons for the differences involved, but the problem remains. Hence the references to J, Yahwist, E, Elohist, D, Deuteronomist, P, priestly, which is neither the earliest nor the latest mainstream format, still serve to highlight incongruent conceptual complexes, even if no longer a source as such. One could, in theory, believe in Mosaic, David, or other forms of authorship, and it would still not make the discrepancies and problems go away in virtue thereof. Just as discovering certain theories in astronomy were incorrect does not warrant a return to astrology, so even if source criticism becomes totally dated, reverting to reading without reference to sources does not salvage realism, and still fails to take the text seriously, because it takes the dogma about the text very seriously. The justification for such an anti-realist perspective on the ontological status of Yahweh as depicted in the source materials can be found by comparing the theologies of J and E. As Friedman, 1987, observed, when the deities of J and E are compared, the God of J and the God of E believed different things regarding what happened in the past. J's Yahweh has a different biography than Yahweh in E. Although Yahweh is usually associated with the name Elohim in this, now least popular of sources in scholarship. Moreover, the God of J relates differently to the world and people than the God of E. There are also serious and substantial discrepancies between the nature of the two deities. They even have different ideas regarding what constitutes normative morality and cultic laws. Logically, then, the deity depicted in J cannot have the same supposed extra-textual counterpart as the deity depicted in E. In fact, it has been suggested that the reason later redactors combined J and E the way that they did was because were the two sources left independent of each other, yet side by side, the discrepancies would become too apparent. Friedman, 1987. This would be intolerable, since having texts that contradict each other pertaining to the nature, acts, and will of Yahweh would surely discredit the whole business of legitimizing later social, political, and religious institutions. Ultimately, however, as Friedman recognizes, the combination of P with J, E and D was even more problematic for realism than the combination of J and E with each other, because P was intentionally polemical, whereas Yahweh as depicted in J-E would denigrate Aaron and favor Moses. Yahweh as depicted in P denigrated Moses and favored Aaron. While Yahweh in J-E held that anyone could be a priest, P's Yahweh insisted that only descendants of Aaron could hold that office. Whereas the Yahweh in J-E had angels, made animals talk, had human habits, and could be seen by humans, Yahweh as depicted in P would have none of that. D, meanwhile, came from a circle of people who were as hostile to P as the P circle were to J-E. These two priestly groups had struggled over centuries for priestly prerogatives, authority, income, and legitimacy. Although suspicious, it is therefore hardly surprising that when the depictions of Yahweh in D and P are compared with each other, one gets the feeling that whatever extra-textual God there may be, these two sources cannot be talking about the same deity. The Yahweh of D endorses the Deuteronomistic beliefs, while the Yahweh of P favors those of the priestly circle. This is problematic for realism, for it suggests that there was never any real Yahweh who did what either P or D claims he did. Rather, the contradicting depictions of the deity suggest that both the Yahweh of D and the Yahweh of P are fictitious literary constructs created by humans for ideological purposes. Now, someone has put all these sources together. Henceforth, one finds that realism is collapsing by the fact. Henceforth, one finds that realism collapses by the fact that the Yahweh of J is not the Yahweh of E, both of whom cannot be the Yahweh of D, who is certainly not the same deity as the Yahweh of P. The combining of Yahweh's JEDP in R resulted not only in an Old Testament depiction of Yahweh, which is problematic for systematic theological or philosophical perspectives itself, because of the irreconcilable internal contradictions. As Friedman realizes, another outcome of the JEDP hybrid deity of R is that, as a whole, the depiction of Yahweh is now one that neither J, nor E, nor D, nor P ever intended. In addition, it is doubtful that R, which is the final redactor in case you've been lost when I mentioned the letter R, was cognizant of the chimerical nature of the deity he constructed. It's a mythical version. The final product is therefore a God who was created by all the authors, but who would be unreal to all of them, even if not from an insider's perspective, where there was a lack of historical consciousness and awareness of theological differences. It makes no difference to the discrepant criteria of identity involved. Think of the Gospels. Many critical scholars recognize that each Gospel needs to be isolated in understanding the content of each. If you try to mesh them together, you have destroyed the message of Mark. You've destroyed the message of Matthew. You've destroyed the message of Luke. And you've destroyed the message of John. That's the analogy I would paint for combining the sources and the various contradictory natures of Yahweh. Technically, the redactor has destroyed any one of those particular concepts. In conclusion, the argument from theological pluralism is the first argument in the case against realism, since the case itself constitutes a cumulative argument against the existence of Yahweh. The particular argument reconstructed here should not be appropriated in isolation. Taken by itself, it does not yet justify thoroughgoing anti-realism. All that has thus far been established is that given the presence of contradictions in the depictions of Yahweh in the text, at least some of the representations have no bearing on supposed extra-textual reality. One of the Yahwehs can't exist. The argument from unorthodox theology. According to what many consider philosophically orthodox Christian views of God, the real God is the only God, 1. The real God can do anything, omnipotence. The real God knows everything, omniscience. The real God is everywhere, omnipresence. The real God is only good, omnibenevolence. In philosophy of religion, these attributes are often disputed as to what they mean and whether they are conceptually coherent. Without digressing into those debates, while acknowledging a need for nuance in other contexts, if God is hypothetically assumed to exist and is as described above, it follows that any instance of Yahweh depicted in ways contradicting the profile of the entity supposed to be the real and only God has no counterpart in the world outside the text. As the previous argument implies, however, the texts listed below are not proof text to justify a certain view of Yahweh as the only, quote, biblical, end quote, view. Alternative perspectives are already acknowledged, and the focus here is simply on the texts, the condition of possibility for the meaningfulness of their religious language, includes unorthodox theological assumptions. Text implying that Yahweh is not the only God. The texts in question are but some of the many examples that seem to allude to an underlying form of theism that cannot be equated with philosophical monotheism.
I shall go through Egypt in this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt of humans, as well as of the animals. And I shall enact punishment over all the gods of Egypt. Exodus 12, verse 12. Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the gods. Exodus 18, verse 11. You may serve no other gods. Exodus 20, verse 2. You may not curse the gods. Exodus 22, verse 28. When Elyon gave an inheritance to the nations, when he parted the sons of humans from one another, he determined the borders of the peoples, according to the number of the sons of El. But Yahweh's portion is his people. Jacob is his measured out inheritance. Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. Thus Yahweh, the God of Israel, drove away the Amorites before his people. Israel, and you want to take it in possession. Will you not take into possession what your God Shemosh gave you as possession, while we take into possession all that Yahweh our God drives out before us? Judges 11, verses 23 to 24. And David said, They have driven me out, so that I may not join the inheritance of Yahweh, when they say, Go away, serve other gods. Now, let my blood not fall onto the earth far away from the face of Yahweh. Psalm 26, 17 to 20. And when the king of Moab saw that the battle got too intense, he took his firstborn son and sacrificed him as burnt offering on the wall. Then a great wrath came down upon Israel, so that they left him and went back to their land. 2 Kings 3, verse 27. God stands up in the assembly of the gods. He judges in the midst of the gods. I have said myself, You are all gods, and you are all sons of the Most High. Psalms 82, verses 1 and 6. For who is like Yahweh among the sons of the gods? Psalms 89, verse 7. All the gods bow down before him. You are exalted over all the gods. Psalms 97, verses 7 and 9. Thus he will act with the help of a foreign god. Daniel 11, verse 39.
From the perspective of popular orthodoxy, There are no other gods. From this, it follows that the depiction of the deity Yahweh, who believes in other gods and operates in relation to their actions, must be fictitious. Yahweh, as depicted in those texts, at least according to a consistent Orthodox perspective, does not exist. Texts implying that Yahweh is not omnipotent. Consider the following scenarios, all of which can be interpreted as alluding to a kind of power, in no way indicative of divine omnipotence in any meaningful sense of the word. Yahweh needs to travel to obtain information. Yahweh is afraid of human potential and shows fear. There are some inevitable future destinies of people that even Yahweh seems powerless to change. Yahweh, after barely overcoming Jacob in a wrestling match, cannot reveal his name and needs to depart from the scene before the light of dawn. Yahweh cannot lead the people by way of the Philistines, as he fears they will want to turn back. Yahweh cannot allow Israel to drive out the Canaanites too quickly for the fear that the wild animals might become too many. Yahweh did not completely destroy all forces of chaos. Leviathan, Yam. Yahweh's people cannot defeat their enemies because they have iron chariots, despite the fact that he was with them. Yahweh is said to need help in some matters and cursed the people who did not come to his aid. Yahweh looks around for assistance. The dead are beyond Yahweh's sphere of control. A closer look at each of these statements shows that, though it is not explicitly and unequivocally noted, there are definite physical and metaphysical limits to Yahweh's power beyond what is logically possible. In other texts, the deity has no problem when faced with similar obstacles. Should one therefore assume that the real God is actually omnipotent, or at least more powerful than Yahweh as depicted in some of the scenarios in the Old Testament? The ontological implications are, once again, all too clear. If the true God is omnipotent, then Yahweh as depicted in the text implying the opposite must be a character of fiction with no extra textual counterpart. If the other is assumed, then vice versa. Text implying that Yahweh is not omniscient. Consider the following examples from the text implying that Yahweh is less cognizant than popular Orthodox conceptions would have us believe.
Then Yahweh said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am going to do, while Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed in him?" Furthermore, Yahweh said, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is truly great, and their sin is very heavy. I want to go down in order to see whether they have actually acted according to the outcry over them which has come to me. And if not, I want to know it." Genesis 18 verse 17. But the angel of Yahweh called to him from the heavens and said, "Do not lift your hand against the boy, because now I know that you fear God, and did not hold back your only son from me." Genesis 22 verse 12. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not let them travel along the road which led to the land of the Philistines, even though it would have been shorter, for God said, "What if the people become fearful when they see war and decide to go back to Egypt?" Exodus 13 verse 17. Yahweh looked down from the heavens upon the sons of man, in order to see if there were any who understand and seek God. Psalms 14 verse 2. And I thought, after she has done all this, she will return to me. But she did not return. I thought how I would set you among my sons, and give you a pleasant land, a heritage most beauteous of all nations. And I thought you would call me my father, and would not turn from following me. Surely, as a faithless wife leaves her husband, so you have been faithless to me, O house of Israel. Jeremiah 3 verses 7 and 19.
If there is a God who knows all there is to know, even what the future holds, then depictions of the God Yahweh, who does not have such knowledge, are implied to have no extra-textual counterpart. They don't exist in reality. Texts implying that Yahweh is not omnipresent. In traditional Orthodox philosophical theology, it is also commonly believed that the real God is omnipresent. Consider then the following passages, all of which seem to imply that Yahweh is, let's just say, not so in any of the different ways in which it is conceptualized in philosophy of religion.
And they heard the voice of Yahweh the God, while he was walking in the garden during the wind of the day. And Yahweh the God called to the human and said to him, "Where are you?" Genesis 3, verse 9. And Cain went away from the face of Yahweh and went to live in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Genesis 4, verse 16. Then Yahweh went down to look at the city and the tower that the sons of man had built. And Yahweh said, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that the one does not understand the other." Genesis 11, verses 4 to 9. And after he had finished speaking with him, God went upwards from Abraham. Genesis 17, verse 22. And he dreamed, and there was a ladder placed on the earth of which the top reached to the heavens, while the angels of God went up and came down from it. And behold, Yahweh stood at its top. Genesis 28, verses 11 through 12. While Yahweh descended onto the mountain Sinai, from its top Yahweh called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses climbed up. And Yahweh said to Moses, "Climb down and warn the people that they must not attempt to break through to Yahweh to see." Exodus 19, verses 20 to 21. And Yahweh came down in a cloud and went to and stood by the entrance to the tent. Then he called Aaron and Miriam, and they came out. Numbers 12, verse 5. And David said, "They have driven me out, so that I may not join the inheritance of Yahweh when they say, 'Go away, serve other gods.' Now let my blood not fall onto the earth far away from the face of Yahweh." 1 Samuel 26, verses 17 to 20. And he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the face of Yahweh." And look, Yahweh went past, while a strong wind tore the mountains and broke the rocks from before Yahweh. But in the wind, Yahweh was not. And after the wind there was an earthquake. But in the earthquake, Yahweh was not. And after the earthquake there was a fire. But in the fire, Yahweh was not. 1 Kings 19, verse 11. Behold, Yahweh comes out of his dwelling. He comes down and treads on the heights of the earth. Micah 1, verse 3.
These are but a few examples of texts that would be meaningless on the assumption that Yahweh is present everywhere. If one assumes the real God is omnipresent, then Yahweh, when depicted as not such, has no extra textual counterpart for the depiction in question. Unorthodox elements in the relation between Yahweh and evil in the Old Testament. Consider the following texts, all of which seem wittingly or unwittingly to implicate Yahweh in the actualization of evil in a most general sense.
And Yahweh answered him, "Who makes the mouth for the man? Or who makes dumb or deaf and seeing or blind? Is it not me, Yahweh?" Exodus 4, verse 11. "Behold, it is I, and there is no other God apart from me. I kill and I make alive, I destroy and I heal, and there is no one who can save from my hand." Deuteronomy 32, verse 39. But he answered her, "The good we would accept from God, and not the evil." Job 2, verse 10. "I am Yahweh. Apart from me there is no other. I form the light and create the darkness. I actualize salvation and create evil. It is I, Yahweh, who does all these things." Isaiah 45, verses 5 to 7. "Who speaks and causes it to happen? Did Yahweh not command it? Does not both evil and good proceed from the mouth of the Most High?" Lamentations 3, verses 37 to 38. "Will evil befall a city unless Yahweh has done it?" Amos 3, verse 6b. Behold, does it not come from Yahweh of hosts, that people toil for fire, and that nations tire themselves out for nothing? Habakkuk 2, verse 13.
If one assumes that the real God is not in such a manner responsible for evil in general, there is only one consistent conclusion possible. Yahweh as thus, depicted in these texts, as interpreted and taken seriously without imposing what one would like to be the case, must be a character of fiction and does not exist outside the text. In sum then, the argument from orthodoxy as reconstructed is ambiguous with regard to its value for the case against realism. It works only on the assumption that if there is a God, then this God has the attributes associated. From this it follows that the unorthodox depictions of Yahweh never had any relation to extra-textual reality. The argument from polymorphic projection. In this section, I reconstructed several arguments to justify the claim that Yahweh is indeed a product of polymorphic projection. What I mean by this will be clarified as the argument unfolds. In brief, it may be said that based on taking the biblical texts seriously, as well as discussions of God in philosophy and religion, any depiction of Yahweh that is clearly the invention of a culturally conditioned and historically determined human imagination cannot exist in the world outside the text. Yahweh's errant beliefs about extra-textual reality. When Yahweh speaks in the first person in the Old Testament, he often makes statements that include references to alleged actual historical, cosmographical, geographical, biological, and other types of phenomena. However, the knowledge Yahweh exhibits about these phenomena often contain elements of error and superstition. If taken seriously, it would seem that the God Yahweh knew about as much about the world as the people who worshipped him, and no more. Consider the following examples. Yahweh himself believes that the universe was created over a period of 6 days. Yahweh himself believes there is an ocean above stars in the skies from where rainwater falls to the earth. Yahweh himself believes that the landmass of the earth floats on water. Yahweh himself believes that thunder is literally his own voice. Yahweh himself believes that the clouds were forms of transport for deities in the sky. Yahweh himself believes that there is literally a place underground where the dead live as shades. Yahweh himself believes in the existence of other gods and the existence of fictitious locations like the mountain of the gods in the north and the garden of the gods. Yahweh himself believes in the historicity of characters like Noah, Job, and Daniel, not the biblical character. Yahweh himself believes in the existence of the mythical creatures like the Leviathan, Rahab, Behemoth, sea monsters, flying dragons, demons of the field, malevolent spirits of the night, etc., etc., etc. Yahweh himself believes that the force of life is in the blood and that the wind equals spirit equals breath animates human and divine bodies. Yahweh himself actually believes that, apart from the wayward people of Israel, all the peoples of the earth worship him and burn incense in his honor. In other words, Yahweh's own knowledge of astronomy, cosmography, physics, meteorology, zoology, biology, and history is but a replica of the primitive, historically and culturally relative superstitions held by the Old Testament peoples themselves. If the realities in question do not exist in the world outside the text, neither does Yahweh, who believes in them. Yahweh's all-too-human divine socio-political setup. Another disconcerting element in the depictions of Yahweh in the Old Testament concerns the way the deity's heavenly socio-political setup is constructed. Consider the following example of what amounts to obvious examples of sociomorphic projection, as opposed to intentionally metaphorical depictions of a supposed transcendental reality or factual representations of an actual state of affairs. Yahweh has a kingdom whose political constitution resembles an first millennium BCE monarchy. Yahweh's abode is a palace where he sits on a throne. A favorite form of transportation in the heavens is horse-drawn chariots. Yahweh has an army of sword-bearing warriors. Yahweh makes use of counselors. Yahweh's abode has first millennium BCE music. Yahweh has sons who, amongst other things, marry, have intercourse, eat bread, sing together, and dress in linen. Yahweh writes on scrolls. See the Book of Life in Exodus 32 and all the sources. The fact that Yahweh's eternal heavenly socio-political scene, and even Sheol, just happens to correspond in detail to an all too particular, all too contingent, and all too human historical and cultural setup gives the game away. It would be absurd to think, for example, that something like a sword or a monarchy is something that exists in eternity and on a cosmic scale, or that a particular dialect of Hebrew is the eternal language of a real God outside the text. If the first millennium BCE ancient Near Eastern socio-cultural contexts do not correspond to how things always were and will be in reality outside the world of the text, then neither do depictions of Yahweh, inextricably linked thereto. Ecological anthropology, environmental psychology, and the ontological status of the nature and acts of Yahweh. A particular people's deities often bears an uncanny resemblance to their immediate environment. The gods of people who live in the ice wastes of the polar regions are different from the gods of the people living in rainforests near the equator. In turn, both of these are different from the gods of subtropical locales or the deities of people living on the grassland plains. In short, the nature, attributes, acts, and the particular modes of revelation and intervention of a region's deities are almost always inextricably bound up with the features and processes of the immediate environment. How this claim might be substantiated can be ascertained from the ways in which the person, nature, acts, interventions, attributes, divine abode, divine servants, etc. of Yahweh are all bound up and dependent on all too local environmental phenomena. Thunderstorms occur in Palestine, and thunder is the voice of Yahweh. Lightning and hell is weapons, and the clouds a means of transport for the deity. Volcanoes occur in the region, and the appearance of Yahweh on many occasions has volcanic activity as part of the theophany. Earthquakes occur in the region and were often perceived to be part of Yahweh's theophany, or a mode of wrath when he was angered and ready to judge the people. Droughts occur in the region, and these are interpreted as being a result of the sins of the people, while good harvests resulting from sufficient rainfall are associated with Yahweh's blessing. The country is flanked by the sea in the west, and so there are stories about the way Yahweh keeps this force of chaos within its preordained limits. To the south and east, there are the desert regions where howling winds blow and wild animals sojourn. Not surprisingly, both the people and Yahweh thinks of these locales as the haunts of demons. Much of the area is dry land, and oases in the deserts are conceived of as being gardens of the gods. Certain types of animals live in the region, and the cherubim and the seraphim of Yahweh bear a striking resemblance to these animals, or hybrid versions, myxomorphs derived from them. The region is at the center of international economical and political developments, and therefore most of the time merely a vassal to one of the superpowers in the southwest, Egypt, or northeast, Babylonia and Assyria, Persia. The socio-political developments of the region are interpreted as being a result of divine judgments on either Israel and Judah or on its enemies. In the same way, one might wonder if Baal could have been conceived of by people living in the polar regions or in the Amazon. One might also wonder whether Yahweh can exist outside his natural habitat in Palestine. For instance, if the Israelites were suddenly transported to a certain polar region where there were no mountains, no thunderstorms, or earthquakes, no rough seas, and very different fauna, what would happen to Yahweh, his acts, and his world? Would he be served not by hybrid beings that are part lion, part eagle, and part bull, example cherubim and seraphim, but maybe by sentinels that are a combination of polar bear, seal, and penguin? If there are no seasonal droughts and no other hostile enemy people wanting control of their territory, how can Yahweh judge his people and become active in their socio-political life? What would happen to the sacrifices to Yahweh in a place where the specific animals and ingredients for the particular offerings are not available? Just as Yahweh's socio-political world is clearly a projection of humans from a certain historical and cultural world onto the cosmos, so too is Yahweh and his relations in the context of the natural environment in which he was worshipped. The all-too-human divine taboos and motivations. Another element of the Old Testament discourse about Yahweh that might lead to the conclusion that it is all too human is the deity's taboos and motivations for action. Example of these as problematic can be had by asking certain questions, which have to be read while bracketing dogmatic assumptions as to the usual answers familiar to us. Why does Yahweh want to create humans to till the soil? Why does Yahweh want to be worshipped? Why does Yahweh want to be feared? Why does Yahweh want sacrifices? Why does Yahweh not want images of himself? Why is Yahweh jealous of other gods? Why does Yahweh need to make a covenant with people? Why does Yahweh want to tell people how to live? Why would Yahweh create animals he considers abominations? Why would Yahweh endow humans with physiological processes he finds offensive or unclean? Why are ambiguous and tedious ways of divination, lots, ephod, the Urim and Thummim, dream incubation, etc., needed when Yahweh could just tell people directly, plainly, and quickly what is the case in any given situation? Why are both Yahweh and his heavenly court all of the male gender? Why is it usually the case that when the people mix with foreigners, they begin to serve the other gods and forsake Yahweh? Why is the reverse not similarly a concern? Of course, answers to these questions are readily available for certain biblical and dogmatic theological perspectives. Yet if we ask these questions and think about them with such apologetic or historical responses, would the answers be in favor of realism? Many far more specific questions like these could be asked regarding certain details in the Old Testament text, associated with etiological and post-exilic concerns of the authors. For example, why does Yahweh speak a particular dialect of period Hebrew when he creates the universe, especially since this language and the particular dialect in which he spoke would only develop in a particular religious community during the first millennium BCE? Why did Yahweh make Adam from dust and create Eve from his rib, rather than in another fashion? For example, creation by word, thought, etc. Why did Yahweh destroy the people via a flood rather than by some other means, like make them all disappear, cause the earth to swallow them, etc.? Why did Moses want Jethro to show them where all the good camping places in the desert were located if the pillar of cloud and fire already indicated this to them? Why did Yahweh want Moses to count the people when surely he could just tell him how many there were? Why would a God feel the need to specify such precise, elaborate, and peculiar prescriptions for the service in his sanctuary? Why should the leaders of a city have to vow that they did not kill someone found mysteriously murdered in a nearby field when Yahweh could simply show them who committed the crime? Why does Yahweh fear that if the people take the route of the Philistines, they will be too scared to fight and want to go back to Egypt, especially since this happens anyway on the route Yahweh himself had chosen? Of course, there are good literary, critical, and religious historical answers to these questions related to the history and composition of the texts. Even so, asking why questions suggest the possibility that the obvious answer to such interrogations may indeed be what not everyone wants to hear, that Yahweh as depicted is the creation of the authors and does not exist outside the text. In sum of the argument from polymorphic projection, what Yahweh knows, believes, and does seems suspiciously similar to the views and ways of humans from the ancient Near East during the first millennium BCE. It seems clear that this gives the game away and unmasks the origin of associated imagery of Yahweh as the product of the first millennium BCE ancient Near Eastern peoples' anthropomorphic, psychomorphic, and sociomorphic projections. If this is the case, then Yahweh as depicted is a character of fiction and does not really exist outside the text. The argument from mythology and syncretism. Whenever there are traces of mythological motifs, syncretism, and superstition in the Old Testament with parallels to non-biblical religions, there are ontological implications. One cannot deny the existence of other gods and affirm that of Yahweh when the latter and the former overlap in identity or in profile. On a literary level, in terms of form, there are many examples related to textual genres such as the covenant, prayers, blessings, stories, psalms, and prophecies, which all have counterparts in ancient Near Eastern religions. More specifically related to the concept of God, consider the following ways in which the character of Yahweh appears to be nothing more than a watered-down version of his predecessors in the Promised Land. Parallels between Yahweh and the Canaanite deity El. There is no explicit and direct polemic in the Old Testament against the god El. The patriarchs are depicted as familiar with a Canaanite deity called El. The divinity referred to in the theophoric suffix in the name Israel, Yahweh is often referred to as El, with or without qualification. Yahweh, like El, is called the bull, not mighty one, of Jacob. Like El, Yahweh is described as being a creator, a shepherd, and a kind and merciful father. Like El, Yahweh is depicted as an aged anthropomorphic deity. Like El, Yahweh has a divine council that surrounds his throne. Yahweh, like El, is called the Father of humanity. Yahweh, like El, lives at the source of the rivers amid the cosmic flood. Yahweh, like El, is often depicted as dwelling in a tent. In actual historical pre-exilic Israelite religion, Yahweh, like El, was often worshipped as the head of a pantheon with Asherah as his consort. B. Now let's cover parallels between the depictions of Yahweh and Baal. Yahweh, like Baal, is depicted as a storm deity. Yahweh, like Baal, has thunder as his voice. Yahweh, like Baal, hurls the lightning as like a spear or shoots it like an arrow. Yahweh, like Baal, is designated as a rider of the clouds. Yahweh, like Baal, is depicted as a son of El. Yahweh, like Baal, defeated the serpent Leviathan, or Lotan. Yahweh, like Baal, had a conflict with Yam, the sea. Yahweh, like Baal, is sometimes depicted in the form of a bull or calf. Yahweh, like Baal, is often referred to as Elyon, Most High. Yahweh, like Baal, has a divine cosmic mountain in the far north, Zaphon. Yahweh, like Baal, is depicted as victorious over Mot, death, and is designated the living God. Yahweh, like Baal, is called Lord, Baal Adon. These parallels do not exhaust the affinities between Yahweh and other gods, yet there are several dilemmas for realism given the existence of such marked syncretism. The syncretistic features in the depiction of Yahweh are older than Yahwism. These pagan depictions are not believed to be the result of actual divine revelation. The pagan deities to whom the particular features were ascribed are considered to be non-existent. The character of Yahweh in the Old Testament is often constructed from the building blocks of such mythological discourse. If this is true, then Yahweh as thus depicted has the same ontological status of the discourse in which he is depicted. Yahweh as thus depicted is therefore himself a character of mythology. Yahweh as depicted has the same ontological status as other mythological gods. Miscellaneous syncretistic features in the cult of Yahweh. The basic structures and operations, the cult of Yahweh is not at all very different from the cults of any other ancient deity. This begs the question, why would the real and only God, assumed to be Yahweh, would want to model his worship on those typically associated with idols? Consider, if you will, Exhibit A, the Solomonic Temple, the construction of which was allegedly commanded by Yahweh himself. Numerous studies have confirmed the suspicion that the architecture of this temple resembles that of Phoenician temples dedicated to pagan deities. Many of the furnishings of the Temple of Yahweh even appear to allude to mythological motifs in ancient Near Eastern mythology. For example, the 12 bulls and the Sea of Bronze are strangely reminiscent of pagan symbolism depicting the deities El, Baal, and Yam. The cherubim resemble the mythical mixomorphs of Syro-Phoenician and Babylonian iconography. The fact that the temple was also called a palace or house of Yahweh and was situated on a holy hill alludes to the myths about the abode of the gods on the cosmic mountain at the source of the rivers. The division of the sanctuary into 3 courts, like Ulam, Hekal, and Dabir, also presumes the factuality of mythical symbolism and was very common in pre-Israelite temples. Given these parallels between Yahweh's temple and that of allegedly non-existing pagan deities, the question arises as to why Yahweh, if he actually existed and hated pagan religious phenomena, as the Old Testament texts insist, would command Solomon to let pagans build his temple according to their mythical conceptions of the cosmos. If Yahweh is assumed to have commanded the building of a mythical microcosm modeled on pagan superstitions, then he is no different from any other ancient deity and therefore does not exist. Alternatively, even if there is a real God called Yahweh, if this God did not literally command the building of his mythical abode, then the deity Yahweh depicted as commanding the building of his mythical abode is a character of fiction and does not exist. In sum then, this section articulates yet another argument in the case against realism in Old Testament theology. There are parallels between the Old Testament and the text of other religions, while the latter predates the biblical discourse. The deities in the parallel mythological motifs and/or legends and/or superstitious representations are now considered not to exist. Yahweh's nature, attributes, and relations were sometimes from motifs derived from representations of those gods. Therefore, Yahweh in these depictions, with reference to those aspects, has the same ontological status as the deities featured in the parallel mythologies, superstitious representations. Therefore, Yahweh, like the other mythical deities, can now be assumed not to exist. The argument from fictitious cosmography. A substantial quantity of research on Old Testament cosmology is currently available. In the present section, however, this very same issue will constitute the focal point of the discussion. After the introductory discussion of some obviously fictitious elements of Old Testament cosmography, attempted to address the issue of the God Yahweh's alleged and actual whereabouts in the world, both within and outside the texts. The solid firmament. In the first creation account, God said,
"Let there be a firmament between the waters, and let it separate waters from waters."
God then made the firmament and separated the waters beneath the firmament from the waters above it. And it was so. And God called the firmament heavens. The Hebrew word for firmament, rakia, also appears 5 times in Ezekiel, 4 times in Ezekiel 1:22-26, and once in Ezekiel 10:1. In each case, the context makes it clear that what is being referred to is literally a solid vault or dome. The description of the firmament in Ezekiel 1:22 also appears to allude to the scenario depicted in Exodus 24:10. In the latter text, Moses and the elders are depicted as dining face to face with their God Yahweh. They also see a pavement of sapphire underneath his feet. In Job 37:18, the question put to Job by Elihu reads,
Can you spread out, Rakah, the sky, and make it as strong or hard as a molten cast metal mirror?
The ontological problem for realism here is that, in the real world, this solid firmament in the skies does not exist in the world outside the text. Moreover, and perhaps more important, not only the people of the Old Testament, but also their God Yahweh believed in and acted as if there really is a solid dome in the sky. But if the firmament does not exist, how can the character Yahweh, depicted as the one who dwells above it, who himself created it, and who genuinely believes in its existence, be considered as anything other than character of fiction? The ocean of rainwater on the other side of the stars above the firmament. Parenthetically, it would be prudent to add a few words about the water that the Old Testament and Yahweh claimed could be found above the firmament. In the Old Testament texts, this body of water was conceived of as being the same as the sea, i.e., it is an ocean. The deep, Tehom, of Genesis 1:2, is divided in Genesis 1:6-7 into 2 bodies of water. The body of water below forms the earthly sea. The water above, since it is the other half of the Tehom, forms an ocean in the skies on the other side of the stars. The presence of the ocean in the skies can be ascertained from the fact that the sky above is blue by day and black by night, like the sea itself. Moreover, when it rains, the opening of the windows in the solid firmament allows a great deal of water to be poured out onto the earth below. It is extremely important to notice the fact that, according to the Old Testament and Yahweh, this body of water is depicted as being above the firmament. From the ancient point of view, this is a logical deduction from the fact that the blue and black heaven appear to be behind the sun, moon, and stars. Moreover, the sun, moon, and stars are depicted as being part of and inside the solid firmament in which they are fixed so as not to fall to the earth. This body of water from whence rains come, as far as the Old Testament texts and Yahweh are concerned, is on the other side of the solid firmament. In the world of the text, it is further from the earth than the sun, moon, and stars. The latter is inside the firmament, whilst the waters are behind it. Apparently, our rainwater comes from the other side of the cosmos. Such an extra-textual scenario does not exist. But what is its implication for the ontological status of Yahweh as depicted in the Old Testament? Either Yahweh believes in this fictitious phenomenon, or he does not. If he does, as the Old Testament texts suggest, then he is ignorant. Since this is inconceivable on the part of the creator of the universe, an arrogant and ignorant Yahweh cannot exist. If, however, Yahweh does not believe in the waters above the firmament, it follows that the deity by the same name depicted in the Old Testament text as having created this non-existent state of affairs and as believing in its reality obviously has no extra textual counterpart. Sheol, the subterranean land of the dead. In the Old Testament's vague and unsystematic cosmography, there is literally a land of the dead underground. While it is mostly assumed and implicit, at some points it is made explicit. For example, consider the plain sense of the text of Numbers 16:20-35.
And Yahweh spoke with Moses and said, "Speak with the congregation and say, be sure that you get away from the dwellings of Korah, Datan, and Abiram." But Korah, Datan, and Abiram came out and stood by the door of their tents with their wives and sons and little children. Then Moses said, "In this you will know that Yahweh has sent me to do all these works, that they are not from my own heart. If these people die like all people and are visited with the visitation common to all people, then Yahweh did not send me. But if Yahweh creates something new, and the ground opens her mouth and eats them with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, then you will know that Yahweh abhorred these men." And when Moses finished speaking, the ground that was underneath them was torn, and the earth opened her mouth and ate them with their households, and all the people who belonged to Korah, including all their possessions. In this manner, with all that was in their possession, these people went down alive to Sheol. The earth then covered them, and they perished from the congregation. All the people of Israel that were present then fled from their cries, because they said, "Maybe the earth will eat us too." Numbers 16, verses 20 to 35.
In this passage, the literal earth literally opens up, and Korah and company go down alive into a very literal underworld called Sheol. Not just the men, but their goods as well, dropped down into the subterranean place, which is clearly not a spiritual dimension in another reality. In texts like these, Sheol is not merely a figurative concept used to denote the state of the dead or simply the grave. As an aside, it may be jokingly noted that the rare incident involving Korah had one upside, contrary to the view of the author of Psalm 49 and many a preacher. Apparently, you can take it with you. If it isn't one thing, it's another. The scenario depicted in Numbers 16, 20 through 35, though rare as far as human descents go, is not an isolated instance in the cosmographical sense. In Isaiah 14:9, Yahweh speaks to the king of Babylon, saying,
"Sheol beneath is moved to meet you when you come. It stirs up the shades for you, even all the chief ones of the earth."
This text points the picture once again of a subterranean realm of the dead along the same line in Amos 9:2. Yahweh himself contrasts digging down into Sheol with climbing up into the skies. As the sky is literally up there, the only reasonable opposition is that it's an antipode. Sheol was conceived of and as being literally down under. Of course, the fact that in all three of the texts noted above, it is Yahweh himself speaking and acting as though Sheol is literally underground. Since there is no Sheol inside or under the earth, which is, of course, in all these texts presumed to be flat, it follows that the God who believes in the reality of the state of affairs must himself be a creation of the people who held such beliefs. In other words, Yahweh as thus depicted is a character of fiction, and along with his subterranean netherworld, does not really exist. Examples of other fictitious cosmographical features. Apart from the aforementioned fictitious phenomena and locations, the following list gives an indication of some additional non-existent alleged realities, contrary to the claims of the Old Testament authors and the God they worshipped, and despite the different perspectives involved regarding each location or event, the places and spaces in view have no extra textual counterparts. The young earth, we know Genesis. We also have 1 Chronicles 1 through 10, that when scrutinized with regard to the dating of creation, leaves us with a 6,000-year-old universe. The order of creation, Genesis 1 with the creation of the sun and the moon after the creation of the earth and its vegetation, and Genesis 2 with the creation of plants and animals after the creation of male human. The duration of creation, Genesis 1 for 6 24-hour days, and Exodus 31:17 for an endorsement of this belief by Yahweh himself. Also Genesis 2 for a total duration of 1 whole day for the creation of earth and heavens. The eternal earth. However, this contradicts the view of Isaiah 34:4 and 51:6. The corners of the earth, the pillars of the earth, and the mountains supporting the vault of the skies. The flat disk earth, the ocean on which the land floats, the storehouses and chambers in the sky for the hail, rain, snow, etc. The low starry heavens, the objective reality of constellations in the sky, the moving celestial bodies, the unmoving earth, the subterranean chamber of the sun, the personified sea with its dragons, the stars as living entities, the desert wastes that are the haunts of demons, the ends of the earth just beyond Armenia, north, Iran, east, Spain, west, and Ethiopia, south. The sun, moon, and stars as small lights beneath the waters above the firmament. The center or navel of the world at Jerusalem. Jerusalem in the far north at the source of the waters. The Garden of Eden at the source of 4 rivers. The mountain of the gods in the north. The garden of the gods. The multiple levels of the underworld. The mountains at the entrance to the underworld. The river of the underworld. Contrary to discussions of whether the existence of God can be scientifically verified or not, the existence of locations in which Yahweh is depicted or not, once the locations and scenarios are evaluated for verification or falsification in the extra-textual realm, modern astronomy, geography, meteorology, and geology may not be able to disprove the existence of God per se, but they can disprove the existence of extra-textual counterparts in which Yahweh exists in the world of the text, that what appears on the list have no counterpart in the world outside the text. Where is Yahweh? Suppose Yahweh does exist in the world outside the text. Where would he be? More specifically, where, according to the text of the Old Testament, does Yahweh himself locate his own abode in the world also alleged to exist outside the text? In response to this question, it is well known in biblical scholarship that there are different views in the text, representative of diversity over time and at any one time. Contemporary readers are, however, so used to a reinterpreted or trivialized biblical cosmology that they do not realize that Yahweh being in heaven, for example, meant being literally located up there. This is evident from what is implicit in related references to divine movement from and to his abode, aside from the temple.
And they said, "Let us build for ourselves a city and a tower, with a top that reaches into the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves so that we do not spread across the earth." Then Yahweh went down to look at the city and the tower that the sons of man had built. Then Yahweh said, "There they are now, one people and one language. And this is just the beginning of their undertaking. Now nothing that they plan will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that the one does not understand the other." Thus Yahweh scattered them from there over the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Genesis 11 verses 4 to 9. And after he had finished speaking with him, God went upwards from Abraham. Genesis 17 verse 22. Then God ascended from the place where he spoke to him. Genesis 35 verses 9 to 13. And Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, "Look, I shall come to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak to you, and so that they will always believe in you." Furthermore, Yahweh said to Moses, "Go to the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes and keep themselves ready by the 3rd day. On the 3rd day, Yahweh will come down on the mountain of Sinai before the eyes of all the people." Exodus 19 verses 9 to 13. "Look down from your holy dwelling in the heavens." Deuteronomy 26 verse 15. Yahweh threw great big hailstones from the heavens on them. Joshua 10 verses 10 to 11. "Cords of Sheol surrounded me, and the cords of death came upon me. When I was anxious, I called to Yahweh. I called out to my God. Out of his palace he heard me. My cries were in his ears. Then the earth trembled and shook, and the foundations of the heavens shook and trembled, for he was angry. Smoke went up in his nose, and a fire proceeded from his mouth. Coals from within him burned. And he bent the heavens and came down, and dark clouds were underneath his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. Yes, he appeared on the wings of the wind. He put darkness around him as huts, the collection of waters, thickness of clouds. Out of the shining before him, coals burned. Out of the skies, Yahweh thundered, and the Most High made his voice heard. He sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning and confused them. The bottom of the oceans became visible. The foundations of the world were revealed by the threat of Yahweh and by the blow of his nose. Out of the heights, He stretched out his hand. He grabbed me, pulled me out of the great waters. 2 Samuel, the 22, verses 5 to 17. Also see Psalms 18, verses 5 to 18. And while they were walking and talking, there suddenly came a chariot of fire, with horses of fire that parted them. And Elijah ascended to the heavens in the storm. So Kings 2, verse 11.
If one takes these texts seriously, Yahweh in the world of the text and heaven is not another dimension or spiritual realm. It is just higher up within what we call the natural world. Readers who think they believe in the biblical God and also that God is not literally up there and do not experience some sense of culture shock when reading these texts have not understood it or its ontological implications. Centuries of reinterpretation have dulled us to the obvious fact that Yahweh in the world of these texts, at least, is located in a domain with no extra-textual counterpart. The argument from fictitious cosmography can be summed up along the following lines with regard to its implications for realism pertaining to the ontological status of Yahweh as depicted in the text. Since the cosmography of the Old Testament that even Yahweh himself believes in is fictitious, it follows that the abode, acts, and person of Yahweh depicted in relation to those features must all likewise not exist in the world outside the text. The argument from fictitious history. In this section, I'm not going to attempt to prove in a positivist fashion what supposedly and actually really did happen, or to deny historicity based on naturalist or other assumptions. Rather, we are simply going to try to take the Old Testament as a whole seriously and run into a few problems for realism regarding the ontological status of Yahweh as a result. The argument from intratextual contradictions. If it could be shown that there exist within the discourse of the Old Testament 2 or more contradictory accounts of an event in which Yahweh was either directly involved or indirectly related to, the following theoretical possibilities arise. One of the accounts is fictitious, and therefore Yahweh, as described in relation to the particular discourse, is a character of fiction, and technically speaking does not exist. Both accounts may be fictitious, and though there might have been an extra-textual reality that the text allude to, Yahweh as depicted in these texts does not actually exist. Here then are but a few of the many historical contradictions that may have anti-realist implications pertaining to the ontological status of Yahweh as depicted in the texts. Yahweh created plants, then animals, then humans, male and female together. Yahweh created a male human first, then plants, then animals, then the female human. People already worshipped Yahweh by name before the flood. People only started to worship Yahweh by name after he revealed it to Moses. Human lifespan is limited to 120 years. Many humans after that exceed this limit. The duration of the flood was 40 days. The duration of the flood was 150 days. The animals on the ark were 2 of each type. They were only 2 in terms of the unclean animals, but 7 pairs were to be taken from the clean animals. The people of the earth had their own languages before the Tower of Babylon incident. The people all spoke one language until after the Tower of Babylon incident, when Yahweh confused their speech. Abram was 70 years old when his Terah died. Abram was 135 years old when Terah died. Ishmael was an infant when Hagar carried him into the desert. Ishmael was already 16 years old at the time. When Jacob fled from his home, he was 40 years old. When Jacob fled from his home, he was 77 years old. Jacob was renamed as Israel by God east of the Jordan at Peniel. Jacob was renamed as Israel by God west of the Jordan at Bethel. The number and chronology of the plagues. The number and chronology of the plagues. The number and chronology of the plagues. The Exodus occurred after a stay of 60 to 120 years in Egypt. The Exodus occurred after a stay of 400 to 430 years in Egypt. The sea was crossed after Yahweh caused a strong east wind to blow. The sea was crossed after Moses parted the water to form 2 walls. The names and numbers of the tribes. A contradictory list of the names, numbers of the tribes. A contradictory list of the names, numbers of the tribes again. Another contradictory list of the names, numbers of the tribes. And another contradictory list of the names and numbers of the tribes. Again, another contradictory list of the names, numbers of the tribes. The routes taken and the itineraries of the Exodus in the Sinai Peninsula. Alternative and contradictory construals of the desert wanderings. The wording of the Ten Commandments. A contradictory version and another contradictory version. Yahweh himself wrote down the law. It was not Yahweh, but Moses who wrote it down. The name of the mountain of God where the law was given was Sinai. The name of the mountain of God where the law was given was Horeb. During the Exodus and the wandering in the wilderness, Israel was commanded to sacrifice to Yahweh. Yahweh never asked the Israelites to sacrifice to him when they left Egypt and were living in the desert. The time when the Ark of the Covenant was constructed, a contradictory account. One version of the Sinai theophany, a contradictory version of the same incident. One version of the manna and quails incident, a contradictory version of the same incident. One version of the water from the rock incident, a contradictory version of the same incident. One version of the golden calf incident, a contradictory version of the same incident. Itineraries in the desert, a contradictory list. The sacrificial animals were slaughtered at the entrance to the tabernacle. The sacrificial animals were slaughtered elsewhere. The Levites were first sanctified at Sinai. The Levites were first sanctified at a later period. Yahweh expressly commanded the Israelites to restrict their worship in the Promised Land to one centralized cultic place. Apparently, Yahweh never required this. The Canaanites were completely annihilated. They were only oppressed. Yahweh did not destroy all the pagan people of the land because he didn't want the wild animals to become too many. Yahweh did not destroy the pagan people of the land in order to see whether the Israelites would be faithful. The process of settlement was quick. The process of the settlement was slow. David killed Goliath. Elkanah killed Goliath. One account of Saul's death, a contradictory version, and another contradictory version. Saul's family died with him. Apparently they did not. Yahweh incited David to host a census. It was Satan who incited David. One version of Yahweh's sundial miracle for Hezekiah, a contradictory version. As can be seen in the textual references of the contradictions presented above, historical contradictions are present both between different books relating the same incident or scenario, as well as within the same book where two or more sources with contradictory data have been juxtaposed. They feature throughout Old Testament history and in every major epoch from creation to the post-exilic period. Moreover, Yahweh could not be involved in two contradictory accounts of the same event if any of those events had an extra-textual historical counterpart. In the case of at least one fictitious account, the ontological status of Yahweh as depicted in the particular text is ipso facto of the same fictitious nature. The argument from cosmographical fiction. In the previous argument, the ontological problems pertaining to fictitious cosmography and its implications for the ontological status of the character Yahweh were discussed in detail. For present purposes, it should suffice to note that certain events depicted in the Old Testament, intended as historical accounts about a past event, cannot be such based on the fact that they feature spatial locations which never existed in extra-textual reality. If it is true that the scenarios depicted in the text involve fictitious spatial locations, then ipso facto, the events occurring therein that are inextricably intertwined with the particular cosmography obviously did not actually happen. Moreover, the God Yahweh, depicted as a character in those stories, therefore never really acted and or spoke in the way described in the world outside the text. Therefore, Yahweh as depicted in text where historical realism is dependent on fictitious cosmography as part of allegedly historical scenarios must be a character of fiction. The argument from the impossible narrator's perspective. Unless one can validly justify a belief in the mechanical inspiration of the Old Testament text, it would seem unavoidable to concede that the perspective of the narrator in certain passages must be judged as impossible. In this regard, the following scenarios apply. When the narrator gives a very detailed account of the private dialogue of the antagonists featured in the narrative, while the text simultaneously implies that no one who could have had anything to do with the writing of the text could in any way have known what it recounts, when a narrator gives a detailed account of what the characters are thinking in secret, when an account is given of acts and dialogue while all present are subsequently killed or related in such as manner as to make any direct or indirect contact with the later author impossible.
And Yahweh the God said, Behold, the human has now become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now, in order to prevent him from sending his hand and take from the tree of the life and living forever. And Yahweh the God sent him from Eden to toil the ground from which he was taken. Genesis 3 verses 22 to 24. Then Yahweh said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am going to do? While Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed in him. After all, I have chosen him, so that he will command his children and his house after him, that they must keep the way of Yahweh and do what is just and right, so that Yahweh can bring upon Abraham what he spoke to him. Genesis 18 verses 17 to 19. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the way to the land of the Philistines, even though it was closer, because God said, The people may repent if they see war and want to return to Egypt. Exodus 13 verse 17. Thereupon Balaam said to Balak, Stay with your burnt offering and I will go away. Maybe Yahweh will meet me, and whatever he lets me see, I will tell you. Numbers 23 verse 3. And they waited until they were embarrassed. But he did not open the doors of the upper room. And when they went to fetch the key and open the door, their Lord was lying on the floor. But while they tarried, Ehud had fled. Judges 3 verses 25 to 26. Then Samson called to Yahweh and said, Lord Yahweh, think about me, and strengthen me just this one time, O God, that I may wreak myself over one of my 2 eyes on the Philistines. And Samson put his arms around the 2 central pillars on which the house rested. And Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed himself with all his might, so that the house fell in on the rulers and on all the people who were inside. Thus were the dead whom he killed in his death more than those whom he killed during his life. Judges 16 verses 23 to 30. And the Philistines heard the sound of the rejoicing and said, What sort of noise like a great war cry is in the camp of the Hebrew? And the Philistines became scared and said, God has come into the camp. And they said, Woe to us, because such a thing did not happen yesterday or the day before. Woe to us! Who will save us from the hand of these awesome gods? It is the same gods who smote the Egyptians with all sorts of plagues in the desert. Have courage and act like men, Philistines. Then you will not serve the Hebrews as they have served you. Act like men and fight. 1 Samuel 4 verses 6 to 9. And Saul said to his armor-bearer, Draw your sword and kill me with it. Otherwise, these uncircumcised will come and kill me and mock me. But his armor-bearer did not want to do this, for he was very afraid. Then Saul took the sword and fell into it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he himself fell into his sword and died. 1 Samuel 31 verses 4 to 5. But when Hadad heard in Egypt that David has slept with his fathers, Hadad sighed the Pharaoh, Let me go, that I may go to my land. Then the Pharaoh said to him, But what do you lack with me, that suddenly you desire to go back to your land? And he answered, Nothing, but please allow me to go. 1 Kings 11 verses 21 to 22. And Jeroboam said in his heart, Now the kingship will return to the house of David. If these people go up to sacrifice in the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem, then the heart of these people will return to their Lord, to Rehoboam the king of Judah, and they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam the king of Judah. 1 Kings 12 verses 26 to 27. Ben-Hadad, who also went into the city, fled from room to room. Then his servants said to him, Look, we have heard that the kings from the house of Israel is merciful. 1 Kings 20 verses 30 to 31. While they prepared themselves early in the morning and the sun went up over the waters, the Moabites saw at a distance the water red as blood. And they said, It is blood. The kings must surely have attacked each other, and the one defeated the other. Now, to the booty, Moabites. But when they came to the camp of the Israelites prepared themselves and defeated the Moabites. 2 Kings 3 verses 22 to 24. And one day, when the sons of God came to set themselves before Yahweh, the Satan also came among them. Then Yahweh asked the Satan, "Where did you come from?" And the Satan answered Yahweh and said, "From journey across the earth which I have crossed." And Yahweh asked the Satan, "Did you see my servant Job?" Job 1 verse 6.
It is not difficult to infer from the wording of these texts that the writers knew they were being creative and not merely report something that actually happened. Throughout the Old Testament, there are so many mundane and in the heat of the action scenes in the text where the possibility and likelihood of any record or detailed memory handed down seems to be ruled out by the text itself. For this reason, theories of revelation and inspiration were required later. However, this is not assumed in the texts themselves. In addition, since the character Yahweh features in many such texts, or is in some way implied to be related to the events depicted therein, realism with regard to the deity as thus depicted must be considered as being problematic. Yahweh as thus depicted related, his dialogue, actions, and relation being the imaginative and ideological construction of the narrator must himself be considered as a character of fiction. The argument from numerical absurdities. Hardly anyone has utilized the argument from numerical absurdities in the text against realism in Old Testament theology as thoroughly as the 19th century Bishop of Natal, South Africa, namely John Colenso, attempted to establish the total number of Israelites. If there were 603,500 warriors were above 20 years of age, when women and children were included, the total number of Israelites who left Egypt must therefore have amounted to at least 2 million. Yet Moses is presented as speaking to an entire crowd. According to Exodus 13:18, the Israelites went out of Egypt armed for battle, which begs the question why the Pharaoh would let the slaves possess arms to be able to form an army overnight. If they had marched out of Egypt 5 in a rank, allowing 1 yard between the ranks, the troops would have formed a line 68 miles stretching from Egypt to the Promised Land. Upon leaving Egypt, they were also issued with tents. That would mean over 200,000 tents would have to have been obtained from somewhere if one assumes that 10 people on average occupied each tent. If each Israelite had 36 square feet or 4 square yards available for living space, the camp referred to would have to be 8 million square yards or 1,652 acres. Yet each day, wood and water were said to be obtained from outside the camp in the wilderness. Human excrement also had to be taken outside the camp for the Israelites.
Must be holy, so that he, Yahweh, will not see among you anything indecent and turn away from you.
The feast related to the Exodus, namely the Passover, also led to numerical absurdities, especially with reference to the time needed for instructing the people, and the amount of male sheep required to be slaughtered also presents difficulties. All of this suggested that from a numerical point of view, the story of the Exodus featuring these details cannot be historically true. It was, however, not the only narrative where apparent numerological problems have led scholars to consider the particular story fictitious. For this example, and with reference to similar scenarios elsewhere, we may conclude that if this is the case, then there is a problem with realism regarding the ontological status of the character of Yahweh, whose words and actions are inextricably bound up with the details of the text. The argument from chronological schematization. The biblical chronology has very little in common with actual historical chronology, and is an ideological, mythical, and fictitious construct presented for the purpose of propagating the belief history is somehow divinely ordered. Hughes, in 1990, provided many tables of chronological data to justify these claims. For example, consider the following instances of obviously mythical and contradictory chronology discussed by the author. Obviously artificial mythical chronological constructs. Creation, 7 days. The age of the world, 4,000 years equals 100 times 40. Pre-Abrahamic period, 1,600 years. Abraham in Mesopotamia, 75 years. Patriarchs in Canaan, 215 years. Post-Abrahamic period, 2,400 years. Time in Egypt, 430 years. Time between Exodus and foundation of temple, 480 years. First temple period, 480 years. Pre-exilic period, 430 years. Exilic period, 50 years. Second temple period, 720 years. In addition, certain other periods seem similarly artificial, schematic, and contrived. Age of Enoch, 365 years. Age of Lamech, 777 years. Jacob flees from his home at age 40. Moses flees Egypt, 40 years old, comes back 80 years old, and dies 120 years old, 40 plus 40 plus 40. Moses on the mountain, 40 days, 2 or 3 times. Duration of desert wanderings, 40 years. Duration of David's rule, 40 years. Duration of Solomon's rule, 40 years. Age of Job before the crisis, 70. And after 140 years, 70 plus 70. Seen from this perspective, what may, from one point of view, be of merely historical or literary interest can have devastating ontological implications for theological realism. If the chronological scheme of the Old Testament narratives of the creation to the post-exilic period is mythical, and therefore fictitious, then so is the deity Yahweh, whose acts are inextricably bound up with and located on that particular time frame. The argument from mythological motifs. In a previous argument, the implications of the presence of myth in the text for the ontological status of Yahweh were discussed. For the purposes of the present discussion, however, it's important to note how mythological motifs in supposed historical accounts tend to complicate realism with regard to the historicity of those accounts. If a story purporting to be history did not happen as depicted, given the presence of a mythological motif, it follows that irrespective of whatever truth the story intends to communicate, Yahweh, as depicted in such a text, is a character of fiction. The argument from alleged archaeological falsification. Based on arguments from silence, the nature of biblical sources, the material culture of the periods in question, comparisons between biblical and extra-biblical historical data, and through other methods of biblical criticism, critical historiography, and archaeology, the following textual scenarios, amongst others, are demonstrably fictitious. A worldwide flood in the 3rd millennium BCE, the life and times of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Joseph as a Hebrew second in command in Egypt, Moses as a son of the Pharaoh, the 2 million strong exodus of Israelites from Egypt, the route of the exodus in the Sinai Peninsula, the conquest of Canaan by Joshua, i.e. Jericho, the situation in Palestine during the period of the Judges, David and Solomon as major role players in the ancient Near East, the repentance of Nineveh as a result of a Hebrew prophet named Jonah, Daniel as a prophet and advisor to the monarchs in Babylon. Suffice to say, if it is true that the historicity of the scenarios noted above have been falsified by archaeology, then whatever god or gods there may be, the God Yahweh depicted as being involved in those scenarios must himself be a character of fiction, and therefore does not really exist outside the text. The argument from anachronisms in the text. One of the strongest indicators that the events depicted in the Old Testament text are not historically factual seems to be the presence of a myriad of anachronisms in the discourse. What is supposed to have been eyewitness accounts, or at least reliable tradition, contains reference to people, places, events, beliefs, and customs that were demonstrably not part of the historical context in which the biblical authors placed them. Popular examples of such anachronisms include the references in Genesis 2:10-12 to Asher, Cush, and the economic importance of gold allegedly prevalent during the time of Adam in 4000 BCE. These references correspond with the scenario in the 1st millennium BCE and not with anything before the Bronze Age. The reference to the name Yahweh in Genesis and the theophoric elements of the personal names prior to the revelation to Moses. The reference to domesticated animals, camels, as well as names of places, Dan, Beersheba, etc. And people, Philistines, Chaldeans, Edomite kings, in the patriarchal narratives, early 2nd millennium BCE, all of which can only be dated to the later part of the 2nd millennium BCE, or seen more reflective of scenarios in the 1st millennium BCE during the exile. The references to the Philistines, Edomites, and Moabites in the story of the desert wanderings 1500 BCE or so, people whose existence as such are only attested from the 12th century BCE onwards. The references to places and religious cultic rites and ideas in Deuteronomy by Moses, which are unknown in Samuel Kings and or not attested before the late monarchic period. The references to peoples and places in the account of Joshua's conquest that did not exist in the time frame projected for the Israelite invasion of Canaan. The reference in the stories of Solomon to the kingdom of Sheba, whose existence is not attested before the 7th century BCE. The numerous projections and chronicles regarding certain elements in the cult of Yahweh in the pre-exilic period, which in fact only originated in the time after the exile. These are but some of the anachronisms scholars have claimed existed in the Old Testament text. If this is true, not only realism pertaining to historicity is at stake, but also with regard to the ontological status of Yahweh, who is depicted as being part of the details of those particular contrived and superficial scenarios. As such, the deity that interacts in these contexts is a character of fiction and did not exist. The argument from intrusive literary constructs. According to literary critical analyses, most of the plot in the Old Testament is of such a nature as to discredit its implicit claims of being historically factual. Aesthetic considerations, literary strategies, poetic agendas, and many other types of rhetorical maneuvers suggest that the authors were more concerned with writing an artistic and entertaining story than bothering with what actually happened in empirical past reality. This is all very well, but from a certain philosophical critical perspective, concerned with the ontological status of Yahweh, this argument against historicity is also implicitly part of the argument of historical fiction against the existence of Yahweh as depicted. For if there never really was a Joseph who dreamt and went to Egypt and landed in jail and became second in command to Pharaoh, what are we to make of all the references to Yahweh in that story? A second peculiar feature of many Old Testament texts that were traditionally read as history is the ways in which certain sections of the discourse appear quite contrived, detailed, poetic, or symbolical. Examples of seemingly constructive and contrived text include songs in the narrative. Did actual historical characters sing, pray, or spoke like this? And who wrote down the exact words? Long and intricate blessings of a dying leader. Various types of prophecies that were obviously vaticinea ex eventu. Extremely detailed speeches in a context bereft of modern recording facilities. Long prayers of individuals. The contrived and fictitious nature of biblical genealogies. The obviously story-like nature of the tales of people like Joseph, Jonah, Job, Daniel, and Esther. Numerical symbolism involving the numbers 3, 4, 7, 10, 12, 40, and multiples thereof. See like 70 nations, 7 3-year famines, 3 days cleansing, 7 days creation, 7 years famine, 7 major judges, each fighting a different one of the 7 Canaanite nations, 7 times around Jericho, 10 plagues, 12 tribes, 40 years wilderness, 40 years reign of Moses, David, and Solomon, 40 days without food, 40 days journey, 70 years in exile, 480 years in slavery, 4,000-year history, etc. Not only some part of narrative seemed contrived, sometimes there seemed to be something suspiciously constructivist about the names of the characters. Consider the names of people like Abel, vapor breath, David, meaning beloved, Nabal, meaning fool, Job, meaning enemy, Machlon, sickness, Chilion, vanishing, Orpah, she who turns her back, Ruth, the companion. All of these seem to encompass the essence of the particular character's role in the particular stories. Abel's life is but a mere breath. Jacob betrays people. Nabal was a fool. Job, or God, was some sort of enemy, and so on. Are we really to believe that actual people got such names at birth and then inexorably lived out the destiny alluded to therein? Or could the presence of such names, and therefore characters, all be part of a literary construct that attempts to communicate elements of irony, tragedy, and the popular ancient motif of destiny and fate? Indeed, the correspondence between the names of the characters and their life stories seem to give away the game and unmasks the fact that one is either dealing with magical fate or otherwise with what is apparently not history. If this is the case, and the names, and therefore also the stories, are merely literary creations with little relation to any historical extra-textual counterpart, then it follows that the character Yahweh, who is active in those stories, must also be fictitious. There is a third important way in which artificiality in the discourse unmasks the fictitious nature of the alleged historical incidents in the text. Yahweh speaking in the first person through the mouths of his servants, the prophets. The first reason why one cannot take the prophetic oracles seriously as being the literal words of Yahweh concerns the history of the text itself. Whatever originally happened that led to the composition of an oracle where Yahweh speaks in the first person, the fact of the matter is that the oracle as it now features in its particular context is a product of the disciples of the prophets from later periods. For this reason, the situation that Yahweh seems to be addressing in a particular text was not the supposed original situation, but one in which the later compilers and collectors of the oracles considered the words to be fitting. Thus, even if Yahweh literally spoke the words ascribed to him, as these now stand, they feature in a context for which humans decided they were relevant and are therefore, in the technical sense, indeed fiction. Words taken out of context and applied to a new scenario, whatever their truth value, are technically not literally the words of Yahweh as the authors or redactors pretend it to be. Second, the currently available words of Yahweh speaking in the first person does not even have the same context as when they were when first written down by the original authors, whoever that may have been. Textual criticism, redaction criticism, tradition criticism, and even source criticism have demonstrated the presence of numerous alterations, adaptations, reinterpretations, emendations, interpolations, and various other types of creative rewriting and editing of the particular oracles. Seen from this perspective, what Yahweh says in the first person is technically not the actual word of a deity spoken long ago. Rather, it is technically the words put into his mouth by subsequent writers, editors, copyists, and other scribes. In the third instance, another indicator of the fictitiousness and artificiality of the prophetic oracles where Yahweh speaks in the first person is, as was noted in the all too human knowledge of Yahweh, where the supposed very words of Yahweh are found in the prophetic oracles, the deity's knowledge of the world, of history, as well as his views on morality, and a host of other issues never transcend the superstitions of his speech writers. When Yahweh refers to fictitious entities like Leviathan, fictitious locations like Sheol, or fictitious history, references to fictitious scenarios from the stories of Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Moses, David, and others, it gives the game away. The presence of such elements in Yahweh's speeches unmasks the fact that the particular discourse was not uttered by an actual and therefore knowledgeable deity. They are speeches constructed by humans who believed in the reality of these things. Fourth, the fact that many things Yahweh predicted would happen did not occur does little encourage to realism regarding the ontology involved. Consider the following examples of what critical scholarship has alleged as being clear examples of unfulfilled prophecies and predictions by Yahweh as depicted in the text. Yahweh said the promised land would extend all the way to the Euphrates River, but it never did. In Leviticus 27 and Deuteronomy 28, Yahweh promised prosperity if Israel was to be faithful to the covenant, but there were times of trouble despite their obedience. In Joshua 8:28, Yahweh said Ai would be destroyed and would never be rebuilt, yet this city was still occupied after the exile. Yahweh believed that the Davidic monarchy's dynasty would never end, but that prophecy was nullified by the exile, after which there never again was a Davidic monarchy. According to Yahweh in 2 Kings 22, Josiah would die in peace, but according to 2 Kings 23, he died in battle. Yahweh believed that the Israelites taken by the Assyrians into exile would return led by a descendant of David's father, Jesse, but this never happened. In Isaiah 17, Yahweh claims that Damascus would soon be destroyed forever long ago, yet it remains inhabited even today. According to Yahweh in Isaiah 19:24-25, also the nations of Egypt and Assyria will become his people, as was the case with Israel. This never happened, and can no longer happen, since the nation called Assyria no longer exists. According to Yahweh in Isaiah 34:17, the region of Edom would forever remain desolate, but this never happened, and it is still inhabited. Yahweh believed in an eschatological scenario, the details of which can no longer be realized because of historical and cultural change. According to the text in Jeremiah 22:18-19 and 36:29-31, Yahweh predicted that King Jehoiakim will be given the burial of an ass, but according to 2 Kings 24:6, the death of this king involved no such event. According to Yahweh in Jeremiah 29:10 and Daniel 9:2, the exile would lasted 70 years, when, in fact, it lasted only 48. Yahweh predicted that after the exile, Assyria would make a comeback and overthrow the Babylonian Empire, but once again, he was wrong. According to Yahweh in Jeremiah 50, the end of the Babylonian Empire would spell the end for the city of Babylon. However, when the empire fell, Babylon continued to be inhabited by many peoples, including Jews, for a long time. According to Yahweh in Ezekiel 26, Tyre would be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, but according to Ezekiel 32, this did not happen. According to Yahweh in Ezekiel 29, Egypt would lie desolate for 40 years, but throughout history this has never happened. According to Yahweh, a new temple would be built with a new united and enlarged Israelite state with water flowing to the Dead Sea, causing it to diminish its salt content and harbor many species of fish. This never happened. Yahweh believed that Zerubbabel would re-establish the Davidic monarchy, but once again, this did not happen. The eschatological scenarios in Zechariah 12-14 can no longer be realized. This is so not only because it has not yet come to pass, but also due to the fact that many of the particular role players involved, House of David, Canaanites, and particular landmarks, locations referred to in the text no longer exist. Yahweh believed that the world would end after the Greek Empire's domination, but it did not. These are but a few of the many examples of what alleged to be Yahweh's own predictions, but which never materialized. Presumably, no real God outside the text would have erred in this way, and consequently, the character of Yahweh issuing these prophecies must be a character of fiction. Finally, a seriously devastating issue for realism with regard to the text pretending to give a verbatim report of the words of Yahweh can be found in the results of rhetorical criticism and literary criticism, poetry analysis. We may marvel at the poetic quality of the composition of the oracles and point out poetic devices such as alliteration, assonance, various sorts of parallelism, wordplay, structural repetitions, inclusios, meter, and a variety of other poetic structures in the text. Curiously enough, however, for some reason, most readers do not even think to consider how the presence of these features is a dead giveaway of its artificiality. That is, in the writings found in prophetic books such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Amos, and the others. We are dealing not with the report of an actual dialogue by the deity himself, but with poetry. See, like a literary construct. Nobody speaks spontaneously in poetry. The fact that the words of Yahweh, speaking in the first person, are poetry gives the game away. It shows that what the text present as the words of Yahweh to the people via the prophet were not literally a recording of an actual oracle of the deity. Based on these observations of the history, composition, and poetic quality of the text, it was possible to establish that what is presented as the literal words of Yahweh and the deity who uttered them have no extra textual counterpart. The argument from metatextual history. This argument focuses on the ontological dilemmas for realism, as these are implicit in some of the critical reconstructions of the origin, nature, and developments of both Yahwism as religion and the texts that would later come to constitute the Old Testament. It will be argued that rather than Yahwism being the one and only true religion and the Old Testament being the inspired word of God, a combined historical and philosophical approach to their origins and development shows that this is not the case at all. An all too human metatextual history. The problem of all too recent origins. From this perspective, having a deity Yahweh arriving at the very earliest sometime during the late in the 2nd millennium BCE appears very suspicious indeed, especially given the fact that according to many Old Testament texts, this deity claims to be the first and the last, meaning the only God who actually really ever existed. Combine this with what has already been pointed out regarding Yahweh's own knowledge, morality, and divine socio-political setup, etc., as being identical to that of the 1st millennium BCE, humans, and the Pharisees exposed. Yahweh stands unmasked as a human creation who has no idea of history before the 2nd millennium BCE. He is blissfully unaware of just how late in arrival his alleged revelations actually are. As such, he is exposed as the belated creation of 1st millennium BCE humans who created him in their own image and not vice versa. He is a character of fiction and therefore does not exist. The problem of all too local origins. It is not only Yahweh's all too recent arrival on the religious scene that gives the game away. There is also the matter of Yahwism's all too local origins. Like the argument from all too recent origins, the argument from all too local origins, irrespective of the theory one endorses in relation to this problem, exposes the cult of Yahweh as another demonstrably human creation with no extra textual divine reality to back it up. The scandal of particularity is indeed scandalous inasmuch as it yields another piece of evidence in support of the main thesis. The ontological status of Yahweh is probably not very different from other local divinities like Baal, Marduk, Zeus, Jupiter, Sis, Quetzalcoatl, Modimo, or whoever else one may wish to name. In short, like these local deities' mythology, Yahweh as depicted in the Old Testament text does not have a reality outside the context of those who worship and write about him. The ontological problem posed the revision of religious beliefs. One will often hear someone referring to the Old Testament view regarding a certain topic, whether it concerns God, ethics, creation, death, eschatology, the spirit, or whatever else. It is not uncommon to hear people claiming that such and so is what the text coherently and systematically has to say about the particular matter. The fact that there are paradigmatic developments to be found in the character of Yahweh's own religious beliefs pertaining to issues of theology, ethics, thanatology, eschatology, and a host of other loci is devastating for realism in Old Testament theology. The people and their gods' beliefs did not simply develop as a result of supplementary or complementary progressive revelation. Beliefs changed via competition between mutually exclusive ideologies and contradictory perceptions of what is what. The change of beliefs, not only among the people, but also concerning what Yahweh himself thinks about a given issue, gives the game away. It unmasks Yahweh as a historically and culturally relative human construct. It shows that there is not really a God who believes those things and actually revealed what he knew to the people. Instead, what we have here are the views of people who in every subsequent period of their history created a God called Yahweh in their image. Their problem with referring to God in the Old Testament. One reason critical scholars are not bothered by theological pluralism and an all-too-human origin of the depictions of Yahweh in the text is because they consider the discourse to provide a historically and culturally relative view of God. With such a designation, it is insinuated and assumed that there is a God and that the Old Testament merely provides us with some particularly Israelite views of him. The reality of a divine nature is taken for granted, and so is the belief that the Old Testament witnesses to that particular reality. However, the substitution of God or Yahweh may be presumptuous given the lack of correlation and associative meaning supplied by some of the readers when they read what they believe about God into each reference to Yahweh. The distortive influence and inconsistency involved in speaking of God rather than the God Yahweh can also be seen in the way Old Testament scholars speak about other deities. For example, these scholars will usually not say that the Iliad and the Odyssey present the Greek view about God, nor will they think of suggesting that the texts from Ugarit give us the Canaanite view of God. The texts of Babylonia and Assyria are not considered to provide us with the Babylonian and Assyrian views of God. To be sure, one suspects that such scholars will, in their treatment of pagan mythologies, not speak of God anymore, but that they will instead refer to the specific deities in question. Apparently, only the Old Testament speaks of God. The other texts speak of mythical entities like Re, Ammon, Marduk, Shamash, El, Baal, Zeus, or Apollo. If these scholars were a little more consistent and objective, they would not speak of the Old Testament's view of God. Instead, they would aim to be more precise by assuming that all the Old Testament provides us with is a people's view of its own God called Yahweh. Like the Greek, Canaanite, and other religious texts, the Old Testament discourse is concerned with a specific deity. Since the texts pretend to express the views of Yahweh himself in actual and normative fashion, follows that if the deity Yahweh as depicted is not real, realism cannot be salvaged by relativizing the discourse and seeing Yahweh as a primitive version of God. As is the case with pagan mythologies, if the deity depicted in the ancient discourse is unreal, realism cannot be maintained by relativizing the theology of the text and suggesting that the God in question still somehow exists, but we have to think about him in new ways. One might as well try to update Zeus or Baal. One might as well claim that even though such deities are obviously fictitious entities, Baal or Zeus per se still exists. The texts merely present us with the Greek and Canaanite views of God. Analogously, trying to equate Yahweh with God, despite the collapse of realism with regard to the depiction of the particular deity in the Old Testament, is equally impossible. If Yahweh as depicted is not real, then the God Yahweh does not exist, not even as God. History of repressed anti-realism. On one way of looking at it, the entire history of Old Testament interpretation and its various cultural contexts can be reconstructed from an anti-realist perspective. Such a viewpoint reveals that the collapse of realism with regard to the ontological status of Yahweh as depicted in the text is not a phenomenon restricted to the post-Enlightenment period. To be sure, throughout the history of interpretation, those who have read the text have experienced some sort of tension between their own views of divinity and the presentation of Yahweh in the Old Testament text. Reconstructing the entire history of interpretation in detail is beyond the scope of this study. However, as a preview of what such a history might involve and how its broad and general outlines may be constituted, I decided to the case by reading the history of interpretation as a history of repressed Yahwistic atheism. Repressed anti-realist tendencies in the Old Testament. As noted in the second argument, already within the Hebrew Bible itself, the collapse of realism becomes apparent. This can be seen in the ways in which the authors and redactors of the texts related to their sources and the received traditions. Through reinterpretation, modification, censoring, editing, redaction, recasting, recontextualization, and rearticulation, many of the writers tried to represent their audience with a contemporary, orthodox, relevant, and updated depiction of Yahweh. This intratextual collapse of realism has been amply demonstrated by the disciplines of source, tradition, redaction, and ideological criticism, as well as through the history of religion and Old Testament theology. Critical Old Testament theology acknowledges the fact of intracanonical diversity that is not constituted by mere supplementary and complementary perspectives on one central element, but by extreme tension, deliberate reinterpretation, and intentional polemical and apologetical agendas. The dilemma posed for realism by the intratextual pluralism within the Old Testament cannot be alleviated by recourse to theories of supposed progressive revelation or theological perspectivism. The Old Testament text shows a marked tendency for intra-religious critique and the collapse of established theological dogma. While some Old Testament scholars might euphemistically refer to this as interbiblical exegesis or theological dialogue, it is actually problematic ontologically. Some authors, redactors, and editors apparently did not think too much of the depiction of Yahweh in other sources, traditions, books, etc. Comparisons between texts like Genesis 1 through 11 versus Isaiah 40 to 55, Exodus versus Jeremiah, Proverbs versus Ecclesiastes, Deuteronomy, Ezra, Nehemiah versus Ruth, Nahum versus Jonah, Samuel through Kings versus Chronicles, etc., etc. All reveal that, for certain authors, realism pertaining to earlier depictions of Yahweh was no longer tenable. As a result, when it comes to the issue of whether realism pertaining to the depiction of Yahweh in the Old Testament as a whole is valid, the implied answer must be in the form of a question. Which Yahweh? Which depiction? Which book's ideology? Which source's ideology? Which stage of transmission? In short, the pluralism in the Old Testament texts themselves witnesses to the fact that technically Yahwistic atheism is already present within the earliest stages of interpretive history. It is not correct to say that the biblical writers were not bothered by contradictions, for they were, and sometimes they were not aware of these, reading the texts ahistorically. Even if they were not, it does not remove the ontological problem. Repressed anti-realist tendencies, the textual variants, Septuagint Targums. Though variable between editions and books, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible in the Septuagint shows a marked tendency to counter what the translators consider to be unorthodox and unbelievable elements in the traditional depictions of the Israelite deity. On a substantial number of occasions, there is a tendency to recast the discourse in a form that is more orthodox or related to contemporary beliefs. There are small but marked differences in matters of historical data, and frequent attempts at harmonization occur. Many obviously unfulfilled prophetic predictions were rewritten to lessen cognitive dissonance and salvage realism. The connotative and denotative senses of words were altered. The depictions of the deity himself in the Greek translations reveal an aversion to anthropomorphism and to monism in the actualization of evil. In short, many elements of the Hebrew text were unacceptable and an embarrassment to later theological sensitivities. Moreover, the translators of the Septuagint held views of history, God, morality, cosmology, and other issues that were typically that of post-exilic form of Judaism. These views have developed to such an extent from pre-exilic ideology that there was an urgent need for the creative and deliberate recasting of much of the discourse. The changing hermeneutics of both reality and scripture can be seen as having been influenced substantially by the larger Hellenistic cultural context. The discourse of the Aramaic Targums, with all its extensions and explanations, also manifest a tendency to read later theology into the textus receptus. This strategy is also indicative of a repression of the collapse of realism, inasmuch as it was felt that the text needed to be explained whilst at the same time creating a different depiction of the divine character altogether. As was the case with the Septuagint, the Targumists often deliberately altered the discourse of the Hebrew text. Thus, there are numerous reinterpretations, modifications, and distortions in the Targums pertaining to the historical, prophetic, ethical, and theological discourse of its Hebrew sources. The ways in which the Targumist altered the received tradition to update its theology and render it more orthodox by contemporary standards reveal the fact that for these authors, Yahweh as depicted in many ancient Hebrew texts was no longer a believable entity, but an embarrassment. Repressed anti-realist tendencies in the Apocrypha and pseudepigraphic literature. In the apocryphal and pseudepigraphical text of the Old Testament, there are numerous allusions to the books that now constitute the Hebrew canon. These allusions often contain additional information and legendary embellishments to the extent that it creates, in a subtle manner, a rather different theology of the original story. There is also a marked tendency to rewrite history and to qualify and recast many of these less acceptable depictions of the God Yahweh. Many attempts were made to remove embarrassing anthropomorphisms in the texts. Repressive reconstructions were necessary to absolve Yahweh of a causative role in the actualization of evil through the creation of a more complex demonology. Too much divine eminence and direct revelation in the older sources were equally unacceptable. Such ideas were considered to be too crude to be real and had to be done away with by creating a host of intermediary beings, angels, to avoid direct contact between humans and Yahweh. Moreover, since many of the heroes of faith had questionable profiles, there was a need to romanticize and idealize the moral character of many an Old Testament character. Miscellaneously, room was also created for the insertion of additional explanatory details to Old Testament narratives, to prevent the offensive elements from being taken as such and to guide the reader in finding a more congenial ideology in the text. In short, through such strategies of rearticulation, the authors of the Apocrypha made it more than apparent for them too realism with regard to the ontological status of Yahweh as depicted was problematic and had, in fact, already collapsed. Repressed anti-realist tendencies in the New Testament. The prevailing interpretation suggests that the authors of the New Testament, whether drawing on the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, or other sources, similarly found it untenable to maintain a realistic portrayal of many descriptions of Yahweh in the scriptures. When it comes to the actual details of history, ethics, messianic prophecy, demonology, cosmology, thanatology, and eschatology, there are numerous and substantial contradictions between the New Testament texts and that of the Old. Though this can partly be explained by the fact that the authors often utilized the Septuagint and intertestamentary traditions, it changes nothing about the reality of the contradictions in question. The way particular New Testament writers handled the text of the Old Testament shows that these are people who by implication would not have consented to believing in certain depictions of Yahweh as reconstructed from contemporary historically conscious interpretations thereof. Manifestations of anti-realism in contemporary scholarly ideology. It would be naive to think that all readers of this study would be blown away and become instant atheists. The history and philosophy of religion provide ample evidence of the uncanny ability people have for dealing with data that contradict what they want to believe. In this section, I will provide an anticipatory perspective of what can be expected should the case against realism be encountered by scholars with deeply held, sincere religious beliefs. The viewpoint to follow is still part of the anti-realist argument and admittedly contains a substantial amount of stereotyping and generalization. Be that as it may, for present and practical purposes, it aims to provide a useful, albeit rough, guide to the anti-realist tendencies even in those contemporary scholars who would otherwise profess to be realist. Anti-realist tendencies in conservatism. In referring to conservatism, I have in mind the type of scholarly communities who believe that 1. God exists. 2. This God is the God of the Bible. 3. This God is also the God of perfect being theology and classical theism. And 4. The Bible is inerrant and inspired divine revelation. As numerous critical studies have demonstrated, however, the realism these fundamentalists actually fight for has little to do with the biblical text and everything to do with their theological traditions, dogma about the supposed nature of Scripture. Moreover, instead of seeing biblical Christians as believers, from our perspective, to the extent that they would deny the problems discussed, actually do not believe in Yahweh as depicted in the world of the text. More specifically, conservatives exhibit anti-realist tendencies when they argue for theological unity and coherency of the text by claiming that the only problems is hermeneutical and that any remnants of imperfect discourse about God or morality can be seen as relativized by the supposed progressive nature of revelation. They argue cannot bring themselves to believe in Yahweh as depicted in the text, but constantly have to mold him into the image of their own theological dogma by endless reinterpretation, selectivity, and repression. They anachronistically and apologetically attempt to play down, rationalize, and reinterpret the anthropomorphisms, psychomorphisms, and sociomorphisms in the text. They piously attempt to rationalize and explain away the apparent presence of mythological parallels, traces of syncretism, and elements of superstition in the text. They argue for the scientific inerrancy of the text with an infinite number of creative reinterpretations of both the ancient discourse and that of modern science. They argue for the historicity of biblical stories with an infinite number of ad hoc rationalizations, conjectures, harmonizations, and appeals to authority rather than accepting the text on its own terms. They also argue bracket ontological problems generated by the history and philosophy of religion by downplaying the all-too-human origin, nature, and development of Yahwism, the Old Testament as sacred scripture, and their own fundamentalist religious ideology. I reckon that, contrary to both their own claims and popular beliefs, conservatives are therefore, in a very real sense, also Yahwistic atheists, in as much as they refuse to believe in most of the versions of Yahweh as depicted in the text of the Old Testament. Unacceptable elements are continually repressed, reinterpreted, decontextualized, bracketed, or evaded, and always harmonized with a view of God derived not from the Old Testament, but from their conservative Christian doctrinal theology. Since they believe that the real God is a Trinity who is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and wholly good, conservatives have to repress the fact that they cannot come to bring themselves to believe in those depictions of Yahweh in the text that contradict these theological reconstructions. Of course, conservatives will deny that the case against realism should be taken seriously as a proof that Yahweh does not exist. In an attempt to refute the case, they will probably quote a plethora of their favorite carefully selected and dogmatically reinterpreted proof texts to prove the inerrancy and inspiration of Scripture, whilst asserting that God cannot lie, that Jesus himself believed the Old Testament was the holy word of God, and that the Holy Spirit assures them of this fact through internal testimony. They will appeal to the work of popular conservative apologists, historians, archaeologists, creation scientists, theologians, philosophers, self-acclaimed pseudo-intellectuals, etc., to ensure their followers that all the problems with realism highlighted have been dealt with. They will provide examples of what they are desperate to believe were successful attempts at solving particular problems, or at providing proof and verification of the historical or scientific veracity of the text. It is supernatural inspiration, its unity and coherency, and its uniqueness in its cultural context. They will focus entirely on one or two of the more questionable claims made, take it out of context, refute it, and then generalize that the whole case is unconvincing and hopelessly flawed and need not be taken seriously. They will stereotype this case as liberal, secular, or atheist nonsense and claim that it is nothing novel, but merely the product of modernist or postmodernist, secular, philosophical ideas resulting from biased anti-supernaturalist assumptions. They will claim that the interpretations of some of the passages quoted in the case against realism are completely incorrect and suggest alternatives to prove inerrancy, orthodoxy, and the text's harmony with conservative dogma. They will attempt to deal with some of the problems presented in the case through certain apologetic strategies involving any of the following fallacies: stereotyping, appeals to authority, circular reasoning, begging the question, unwarranted assumptions, economy with the truth, ad hoc hypotheses, ad hominem critique, changing the subject, appeals to pity, speculations with no basis in the text, distortion of the issues, etc. Conservatives will always be more than ready with answers to the problems presented. They will not come to the case with the intention of learning the truth, whatever that may be. Instead, they have already made up their minds that whatever contradicts what they believe cannot possibly be true, even if it is in the Bible itself. Hence, the need for dogmatic eisegesis, reinterpretation, and forced harmonization. Moreover, the fundamentalist laity, desperate enough to believe anything as long as it salvages conservative dogma, will usually accept everything the conservative scholars say, no matter how far-fetched. Few lay people of the conservative mindset can remain objective enough in reading the literature of their scholars. They have a notorious inability to ask themselves whether the problems their conservative scholars dealt with were really solved, or whether one of the informal fallacies noted above may be present in the apologetic discourse. In sum then, though conservatives will generally claim to be realist, the realism they actually fight for has little to do with that of the biblical text and everything to do with their theological traditions' dogma about the supposed nature and expected contents of Scripture. Conservatives are blind to the fact that the God they believe in is the God of the early Christian philosophers, aka the Lord rather than Yahweh, as depicted in the text. Anti-realist tendencies in critical scholarship. Under the designation critical scholarship, I refer to the discourse of those who believe the following. 1. God exists, however they may define God and exist. 2. The God of the Bible and Christian philosophical theism is different, but historically related and ultimately identical. 3. The Bible contains unorthodox elements, errors, fiction, and myth. It should be clear that though they appear to be critical realists, liberals, are anti-realist when they, without thinking about the ontological implications of their views, admit that the Old Testament contains contradictory perspectives on Yahweh, admit that there are unorthodox elements in the depiction of Yahweh which are not true as a depiction about the nature of the real God, insist that the depictions of Yahweh in the Old Testament are merely Israel's historically and culturally relative human perspective on divine reality, admit that there are traces of myth, superstition, and syncretism in Old Testament Yahwism, admit that the Old Testament cosmology is a fictitious construct, insinuate that Yahweh never really appeared, talked, and acted precisely as depicted in the texts, admit that the history of the formation of Yahwism and the Old Testament can be presented secularly and sociologically as expressive of the all-too-human will to power of culturally contingent ideologies. Of course, many liberals will dismiss the case against realism as misguided because they will claim that its critique of the Old Testament God talk is based on a serious misunderstanding about the purpose of the Old Testament as religious discourse. They will argue that the kind of philosophical analyses prevalent in the case against realism, attempting to prove that Yahweh is not real, is based on a misconception of the nature of truth and the symbolic and metaphorical, pre-philosophical and pre-scientific language of the Bible. They will dismiss it as resultant from rationalist and positivist assumptions and form a modernist. They will dismiss it as a resultant from rationalist and positivist assumptions and from a modernistic hermeneutic with a view of history and epistemology that is alien to the culture of the Old Testament peoples and ignorant of the latest developments in philosophy. They will convince themselves that one need not pay any attention to this illegitimate enterprise of reading the Old Testament from viewpoint of philosophy of religion, which they may feel puts unfair and hermeneutically illegitimate demands on the texts. They will rationalize their evasion of ontological problems by claiming that the Old Testament is not intended as a textbook for philosophy, history, science, or theology. They will agree with some of the claims, but will not be bothered by this as they view the erroneous views pertaining to matters of history, science, and theology as simply Israel's limited perceptions, thus repressing the fact that Yahweh as depicted shared the people's superstitions and that no other Yahweh has thus far revealed himself. They will argue that the presence of myth and fiction is no problem and that these genres can equally well serve as a vehicle to communicate profound religious truth. They will claim that most of the God talk in the text were in fact contrary to appearances never intended literally, but always metaphorically and symbolically, so that pluralism and anthropomorphism is no problem. They will argue that problems with realism are nothing novel and have been dealt with in the last 2 centuries of German biblical criticism, dialectical and postmodern theology and philosophy. They will claim that it is impossible to prove that Yahweh does not exist, and that any attempt to do so is naive, pointless, ridiculous, or theologically immature. According to the case against realism, all such objections are either invalid, irrelevant, or both. As such, they amount to little more than a masked apologetic attempt to repress the devastating and far-reaching ontological implications of admitting to the all-too-human nature of Old Testament religious language. In some of the argument from metatextual history, no one can or has ever believed in Yahweh as depicted, despite the conceptual historical links between Old Testament and later biblically related forms of theism. The domino effect of the collapse of realism in Old Testament theology. With the 7 arguments in this case, I am claiming that anti-realism is the only possibility left in Old Testament theology. Moreover, the implications of the collapse of realism with regard to the ontological status of Yahweh as depicted in the text may be more far-reaching than many in the know would like others to believe. If realism has collapsed with regard to the ontological status of Yahweh as depicted in the text, there may be a domino effect. The result of this may be devastating for any other theology, somehow related or dependent on realism in Old Testament theology. In other words, the collapse of realism in Old Testament theology can lead to the justification of full-blown atheism, despite the problems attached to speaking of the God of X, where X is the Old Testament, the New Testament, Christianity, or philosophy. Additional nuance is assumed in the following line of reasoning that refuses to bracket biblical theology with the either history or philosophy of religion. Yahweh as depicted does not exist. It has been shown via the reconstructed case against realism that Yahweh as he is depicted in many Old Testament texts is demonstrably a character of fiction. Therefore, one may conclude that Yahweh as depicted in these texts does not exist. Therefore, Yahweh per se does not exist. Some may wonder whether it might not be possible to claim that the God Yahweh as such could still exist, because technically, all that the arguments in the case against realism have proved is that certain, but not all of the depictions of Yahweh in the text may be fictitious. Moreover, the reader might recall that it was admitted that I was only able to concern myself with the collapse of realism concerning most but not every single one of the depictions of Yahweh in the text. It is practically impossible to discuss all the issues and invalidate every form of realism with regard to every single verse in the Old Testament. However, things are not that simple, and realism cannot hope to remain immune on such a technicality. In fact, it was neither necessary nor possible to refute realism with regard to every single verse in the Old Testament before it could be confidently claimed that realism pertaining to the whole has collapsed. When realism collapses in so many foundational depictions and in so many ways, whatever texts were not explicitly referred to can hardly be considered as remaining untouched, given the collapse of realism with regard to all the surrounding discourse. Therefore, the God of the Old Testament does not exist. The body of text that was the object of scrutiny for the case was the discourse in the biblical literature that Christians refer to as the Old Testament. This is an ideological designation, not derived from the texts themselves, and assumes the New Testament juxtaposed to the Old. But if Yahweh as depicted, and also Yahweh per se, does not exist, then ipso facto the God of the Old Testament is obviously a character of fiction. If Yahweh does not exist, then the God of the Old Testament cannot be real either. Therefore, the God of the New Testament does not exist. As was noted in the previous paragraph, the Old Testament forms part of the Christian canon that includes the New Testament. Moreover, a lot of research exists by which all of the arguments in the case against realism in Old Testament theology can be constructed to show what is problematic with realism in New Testament theology as well. Theological pluralism, unorthodox theology, polymorphic projection, mythology and syncretism, fictitious cosmography, fictitious history, metatextual history. Though possible, such a collapse of realism in New Testament theology is not necessary to prove that the collapse of realism in Old Testament theology may have pan-atheist implications. In all their attempts to show that the Jewish scriptures support their interpretation of messianic prophecy and theological argumentation, the New Testament authors frequently quoted or alluded to the Old Testament text. From the way the Old Testament is utilized in the New, hermeneutically questionable though it may be, it is clear that the God they claim to believe in was the same God witnessed to in the Hebrew Scriptures and the Septuagint. It is a relatively unproblematic assumption that the God of Jesus, Paul, and all other New Testament believers was believed to be none other than Yahweh himself, even if Yahweh as depicted were by implication no longer believable. The devastating and far-reaching implications of the case against realism in Old Testament theology for realism in the New should therefore be very clear. If Yahweh as depicted in the Old Testament does not exist, and Yahweh per se, and therefore the God of the Old Testament, is not real, it follows logically that the God of the New Testament, which is presumed to be the same God, must himself be a character of fiction. Therefore, the God of the Bible does not exist. If the God of the Old Testament and therefore the God of the New Testament does not exist, it follows that the God of the Bible cannot be real. Even though throughout this study, it has been implied that popular concepts like the God of the Bible or the biblical view of God are endlessly problematic. This only confirms the pan-atheist consequences of the case against realism. If Yahweh as depicted does not exist, and therefore both the God of the Old and New Testaments are fictitious entities, realism in a pan-biblical theology is also invalidated. Therefore, the God of Christian systematic theology does not exist. Christian theology can hardly be considered as being Christian in any meaningful sense if there are no allusions whatsoever to or dependence on any of the biblical materials, motifs, and imagery. Though there are a myriad of different Christian conceptions of God, few, if any of them, would deny that the God they worship is none other than the God Yahweh. Whatever critical theologians may claim about how Christian theology can survive without the veracity of the Bible, it should now be clear that this way of looking at things involves strategies of evasion and repression. If realism in the primary epistemological sources, the Old and New Testaments, collapses, what justification remains for believing that a God identified with the God of the Bible exists at all? Isn't it a bit like claiming that Homeric mythology does not need Homer's myths, and that one can still believe in the existence of the Homeric Zeus, even if the deity is depicted in the sacred text as obviously a human literary construct with no extra textual counterpart? You can if you want, but personally for me, it's not quite the same. Since Christian theology assumes the reality of the God whom the Bible supposedly witnessed to, if realism in the biblical theology collapses, so does realism in any other theology in any way rooted in, related to, or dependent on it. If realism pertaining to the biblical theology collapses and Yahweh does not exist, all the versions of a God constructed by theologians throughout the history of dogmatic or systematic theology are themselves fictitious and must be considered as being products of creative and reconstructive mythology. Again, there is nothing stopping scholars from doing this, especially seeing as we have been making it up over centuries anyway. But knowing one is doing it makes it difficult to take oneself quite as serious as was possible when others were doing it and one was not aware of how the trick was done. Therefore, the God of Christian philosophy of religion does not exist. As noted before, if Yahweh does not exist, then any sort of theism that is any way whatsoever linked to, rooted in, derived from, and dependent on realism of any part of the Old Testament text whatsoever is repressing its anti-realist status. That is why the collapse of realism in biblical theism leads inevitably to the collapse of realism in philosophical theism, since the latter is indisputably in many ways rooted in and related to the depictions of Yahweh in the biblical discourse. The problem here is twofold. Philosophers of the Christian religion either tend to bracket the history of religion and the problems of biblical theology. Alternatively, even when taking notice of the collapse of realism with regard to the Old Testament's depiction of Yahweh, they fail to understand its ontological implications. This allows them to repress the fact that the God they are reconstructing and whose existence they attempt to prove is supposed to be none other than the unreal Yahweh himself. If Yahweh does not exist, how can any updating of his alleged profile make the deity any more real? Even should philosophers of the Christian religion succeed in proving that some God might exist, what use would it be if the deity couldn't be equated with Yahweh of old? Is not proving the existence of a deity with a nature and attributes different from that of Yahweh as depicted in the text tantamount to an indirect disproof and veiled admission that Yahweh as depicted must himself be unreal? Why bother retaining the concept God or the label Christian for one's theology if the new view of ultimate reality is not derived from traditional sources and has little, if anything, in common with earlier ideologies of biblical theology? Whether it concerns the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the argument from design, the teleological argument, the argument from morality, the argument from religious experience, Pascal's wager, or whatever other theistic argument constructed to prove that God exists, since the profiles of the deity assumed by those who put forward these arguments are usually at odds with many of the depictions of Yahweh in the text, claiming that God exists seems indeed to be tantamount to insinuating that Yahweh does not. But if Yahweh does not exist, how can God, who from a Christian perspective is supposed to be none other than Yahweh himself? All the popular philosophical theistic arguments, if they pertain to the Christian God, must repress the problems noted in the 7 arguments reconstructed in the case against realism. The individual arguments in the case against realism undercut all the traditional theistic proofs, since the arguments destroy the foundations, the roots, and heart of all biblically based or derived forms of theism. They are much more effective than any other popular contemporary arguments against the existence of God. Thus, as Nietzsche wrote in another context on historical refutation as the definitive refutation, in former times, one sought to prove that there is no God. Today, one indicates how the belief that there is a God could arise and how this belief acquired its weight and importance. A counter-proof that there is no God thereby becomes superfluous. When in former times one had refuted the proofs of the existence of God put forward, there always remained the doubt whether better proofs might not be adduced than those just refuted. In those days, atheists did not know how to make a clean sweep. Friedrich Nietzsche, Daybreak, Book 1, Aphorism 95. Verdict. If you've made it this far, you're a serious trooper, and I hope you can understand the complexity and how much more could be drawn out by examining these all too human aspects and the mirroring of the human author of the deity at the time they wrote just so happens to look just like their ideas, God's knowledge, his courtroom, everything he did in so many ways is only pertinent to their understanding of the day, meaning there's an expiration date, a timestamp on that deity. Very interesting observations by Dr. Yako Gerber, and you can go read the paper for a more exhaustive takedown, but pretty much this documentary covered the gist of what he is arguing. Look up all the sources for yourself. I ask, as an ex-Christian who's clearly persuaded that the arguments he made here are solid, and so many critical scholars recognize what he's saying, just not drawing openly or publicly those ontological conclusions that Yahweh, therefore God, as understood as Yahweh, does not exist. I want to make one point. In my observation is, even though Yahweh does not exist, I'm not, or I don't think Yako is suggesting that the authors did not believe that some superstitious being called Yahweh exists in their minds. It is a figment of imagination and therefore fictitious, but in the literary sense, it's clearly fictitious. So just like they had superstitions about death and Leviathan and Yahweh and other such things, they're fictional elements that show up in iconography we can discover through archaeology in the textual data and such of these beliefs. This God is a literary work that is only the imagination of its authors and those who may believe like the authors. Very, very important documentary taking down and what are the implications for the Christian religion when Jesus is technically the continuity and fulfillment of all of this stuff that we read in the Old Testament when the God itself doesn't exist. What do we make of resurrection? What do we make about raising the dead or walking on water and all the miraculous and apocalyptic claims? What do we do if we applied the same exhaustive method he did here with all the New Testament scholars we have brought on MythVision, showing the apocalyptic failure of Jesus, the discontinuity between authors and continuity, how they used earlier books Gospels and then reconstructed narratives. They took liberty on recrafting the stories of the resurrection with Jesus, or making claims that Jesus said different things that oppose the other Gospels. There's so many elements we can highlight to show why this did not happen, and it's far from believable to think this is true and that we should believe these things that the apologists want to sell us. The whole package is a very, very used car. A very, very used car that is built of so many different components that really don't fit. And that image of that car would be a very ugly car if you really take it in. Instead, they want to paint this picture, a picture that is so foreign from the text itself. We want to get back to what the original said. And while we are showing that Yahweh doesn't exist, I still find interest in learning about these ancient religions in an anthropological, almost like an artistic way of looking at what they believed and why. I haven't lost interest in that, and I hope you haven't either. Please help support us. The work that we're doing is very difficult, and it's time-consuming, and it requires help. If you like what we're doing, you want to hear a lot more of this kind of stuff. You want to see deep dives into the mythology that built the Bible, mythologies that predate the Bible that built those civilizations and their stories. We plan on doing all of this and tackling various stuff over time. You can help us. One-time donations are in the description. Joining our Patreon and becoming part of the family. Joining the YouTube membership program and becoming part of the family. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. Like the video. Share this content. Comment your thoughts down below. All of these things help us to keep bringing you cutting-edge, critical thinking and scholarship. I hope you enjoyed Yako's work, and I hope you enjoyed the visuals and the work we're producing here at MythVision. Please join us. And never forget, we are MythVision.